The brandsman's iron hissed in the trough, and the sound eels of steam made Sorrel Keating think, absurdly, of snakes fleeing a fire. Heat licked her face. She could taste sour metal on her tongue-old blood and the charcoal stink of burned. Hoof, and when the iron emerged it glowed the color of a mean sunrise, the sort that made people tighten their belts and keep to themselves. Left collarbone, Captain Dervin Pike said, speaking more to the spectacle than to the brandsman. Visible beneath a decent dress, impossible to hide under a worker's shirt, will make the lesson travel. Sorrel, wrists roped to the post, refused to bow her head. The wooden platform in the square of Whetstone felt too high, too exposed. She could see the whole town because the whole town had come to see her. Haberdasher in his stiff collar. Stable boys with hay in their hair. Mrs. Corley tight-lipped behind her booth of winter pears. The wind collected the dust between their boots and lifted it, as if time itself was trying to erase the moment before it was done. Rebel. Someone whispered, a word tossed like a pebble into a well to hear how deep it went, it dropped along. Way in Sorrel, she would not give them the sound they wanted. She pressed her teeth together, shaped her mouth into a straight bit of iron, and counted her heartbeats. 4, 5, 6. The brandsman approached. The wind, fond of tricks, snatched Sorrel's hair from her shoulders and laid it like a black scarf against the post. She smelled the iron before she felt it. When it touched, the world narrowed to a bright, white coin of pain. Her breath left her in silence. The iron wrote its letter R for whatever word Pike needed to say aloud to make his story true. The flesh sizzled. Her vision went full of little lights like snow in summer. Then the iron lifted, and something inside her that had been braced and braced finally let go. Mark taken, the brandsman said, voice flat with habit. He plunged the iron back into water. Another hiss. More snakes fleeing. Sorrel watched the steam rise and thought, I will not break here. The first thing she saw when the world widened again was not Pike's expensive boots or the smirks of the Harper, twins near the front, but the old clock tower that leaned over Whetstone Square like a big-boned ant. The minute hand was stuck a hair shy of the 12, had been for years. Someone, long ago, had promised to fix it. Someone never did. The town learned to glance and subtract and add. Whetstone was like that. People made do with what hurt and told themselves they liked it. Pike stepped closer, his shadow crossing her boots. He wore the new blue-gray of the governor's militia, uniform cut too well for a man who liked to ride. He always made the cords at his neck too tight. The flesh above them creased like a sausage. You'll be remanded to labor outside the line for 1 year, he declared. Brand identifies you as a traitor to order. Speak the confession so. It's done. Sorrel tasted iron again. The rope cut her skin where she'd strained. I confess to refusing a levy, she said, voice low but clear. Not to treason. Pike's smile was practiced. Refusing the governor's levy is treason. He liked saying governor the way some men like saying their own names. He tilted his head at the crowd. She will spend a year building a road we can be proud of. Perhaps she'll find humility out there. He leaned close, his breath a sour stew of coffee and triumph. Or perhaps the distance will eat her. The line has a way of reminding people whose land they travel. Sorrel kept her face still, but her thoughts darted. The line 50 miles of ungoverned scrub where the last war had burned itself down to coals. Beyond it, the border to the free quarter, whose name tasted like water in a dry mouth. If she could reach even the line itself, there would be ravines, low creeks, outcroppings of broken basalt places to hide, to double back, to vanish, but they would march her in irons to the work camps first. She could see the wagons already. The one that rattled. The bored boy whose hair fell into his eyes. The way chain links sounded against planks. Sorrel had built that whole scene in her head last night, laying awake straw-pricked and stubborn in the lockups below the courthouse. She always built. It was her way of surviving, If she could make sense of a thing's shape, she could endure. Its weight. Pike gestured. A corporal with a jaw like a brick, Mathers Sorrel thought. She kept names in a ledger in her head because names were useful. Stepped forward with a knife to cut the rope. Sorrel's arms fell heavy and numbed. The corporal's eyes snagged on the brand. Men looked at it the way they looked at a sudden hole in the road. Sorrel watched him not look away. "Chain her," Pike said. "Let me wrap the burn," said a voice from the crowd, small and bright like a struck match. It belonged to Morel Pan, who set broken wrists and brewed willow tea and brought babies red-faced as apples into the world. "You want her for labor. You won't let the mark rot." Pike didn't turn his head. "You may wrap it," he said, "but nothing that hides it." "Not today," Morel shouldered through the crowd. Up close, her hands were steady with outrage. "Look at you," she murmured to Sorrel, as if the two of them were alone. "That line on you won't say who you are, remember that." Sorrel swallowed. The cloth was cool and wet with some bitter leaf. It made stars of her eyes again. "They think the letter means the story," she said softly. "They'll read the wrong book." Morel's mouth tightened. "Then we'll write." Another chain slipped over Sorrel's wrists like a cold idea. They took her off the platform and through the parting people down the main street. Children craned. Men pretended they had hay to sweep. The wind had its own errands, pushing at Sorrel's shoulders as if to say, "Go now, go now." She didn't look for her mother. Mara Keating had died when the Spring River went big and took her by the ankle. Sorrel didn't look for her father either. Tarn had been gentle until the world made him mean. He had left and taken his meanness somewhere else. She looked instead for the shape of the road out of town. A white strip between sage that led east, toward the work camps and the line. They put her in the wagon with two others, a fence cutter with a chin full of ash who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, and a woman older than Sorrel by 20 years, whose hands trembled but whose gaze was sharp enough to cut rope. "Name," the older woman said without decoration. "Sorrel Keating." "Ank Berries," the woman said. "Don't let your tongue touch the brand. It's trouble if you do." Sorrel didn't ask how she knew, because it seemed exactly the kind of thing you learned the hard way. The wagon jounced. The town shrank behind them, became a tilt of roofs, then a smudge, then a curtain of dust. Whetstone was a grit on Sorrel's tongue and a scrape at her heart. She had moved 3 times in her life, once in her mother's arms, after Mara fled a man who thought fists were sentences, once when she learned to stand and decided standing could be a way to go, and now, chained and branded and outward bound. The third move would matter most. Pike took the lead on his bay, as if he liked the picture of himself ahead of the suffering. Mathers rode beside the wagon, jaw set, eyes forward. 4 other militia in blue-gray followed, their rifles easy in their hands. On 3 sides, the scrub lay like a mottled hide, all the colors of thirst. On the 4th ahead, the horizon kept its secrets like a closed mouth. Sorrel examined the chain. She counted how many links it took from her wrist to the floorboard. She watched how Mathers' chest rose and fell, what made his gaze stray. He looked at Ank when Ank spoke. Perhaps he had a mother like her who snapped beans into a cracked bowl and made you eat even when you said you weren't hungry. He looked at Sorrel's brand when his jaw tightened, as if refusing to see it would mean he had a choice. They camped at sundown in a finger of cottonwoods by a dry creek. The light leaned gold against the trunks, making the bark look like it had stored lightning. Mathers hammered a stake into the wagon's flank and chained Sorrel and Ank to it. The fence cutter's name turned out to be Loot. One of those brittle names people gave to sons when they ran out of hopes. Was chained to the wheel. Pike inspected the fire as if flames were expected to salute. He did not eat with his men. He did not glance at the prisoners. Men like him believed that cruelty was dignified by distance. Sorrel filed it away with the rest. Ank ate like a woman who had taught others to eat through sorrow. She broke her biscuit and gave half to Sorrel, without asking if Sorrel wanted it. "You have to heal from inside," she said. "Skin remembers, so you feed it. Did they brand you?" Sorrel asked before she could stop herself. Ank's mouth flattened and then softened. "Once," she said. "Not like yours. They branded me for tithing backward when the tithe asked me for a child I didn't have. It doesn't matter now. Skin is a page. We get more words." Sorrel turned her biscuit over and over in her hands. She imagined stories printed on her ribs, on the meat of her shoulders. The one on her collarbone was only a letter. It couldn't tell what she loved. Thunderheads stacked like books. The creak of a saddle warming in sun. The exact note a hawk makes when it lets you know it's not hunting you. She imagined someone reading her wrong and felt anger lift its head inside her. Not a howling anger. No, it was too cold for that, too deliberate. It felt like a knife laid flat. Pike kept them moving. Sorrel watched the men who watched her. Mathers had a tell. When he was tired, he cleared his throat before he spoke. When he was anxious, he bit the inside of his cheek and looked left. When he was bored, he hummed a hymn. That had too much pride in it for a hymn. She stored each piece. At noon, they saw riders, 2 small figures on the south ridge. Far enough the heat made them wobble like bad words. Pike went still in the saddle and lifted his field glass. His jaw did a small, ugly dance. "Scouts," he said, like the word had an insult rolled inside it. "Governors or free quarters?" Mathers asked. Pike snapped the glass shut. "The kind that don't wear colors." "Coyotes," Lute whispered, and Ank, a woman who had taught children what was and was not a coyote, said nothing. The figures did not come closer. They followed at a distance, the way a patient man follows the scent of something he wants to. "Eat." Pike changed their route, as if crossing his own tracks was a way to get out of them. The figures did not care about the route. Until dusk, they rode the ridge as if it was a road only they could see. The night came twitchy. Bodies remember being looked at. The militia took watch in pairs. Pike did his numbers and decided he would not take a watch at all. Sorrel lay with the chain around her wrist and thought of the 2 riders on the ridge. She pictured their hands, their boots. What kind of men wore so much silence? One of them, she decided for no reason she could name, didn't speak if he didn't have to. She liked that. Words were precious and could be hoarded in the right ways. On the morning of the 3rd day, the riders had vanished. It should have made the air softer. It made it worse. The land gave them the line by mid-afternoon without ceremony. One man pointed to a shallow trough running east to west and called it a border. Another man put up a sign with a skull on it, and that made it official. Sorrel had always imagined the line as something you felt in your teeth. Instead, it was exactly like any other stretch of scrub if you looked at it with your eyes. The difference was in how men used it to tell the story of who mattered. "Out," Pike said when they reached the roadworks, the word clipped as a knot. The yard spread before them like an old scar, huts knocked together from planks and stubbornness. A line of rock sleds. Men and women with the color of sleep left on their faces. A foreman with sunburned ears hustled forward, bowing like a boy in a storybook. "Captain Pike," he said. "We're honored." "Put them on rock," Pike said. The 2 women together. "Let the mark breathe." Sorrel stood on the yard with a shovel in her hands and pretended it was a freer thing. Men watched her brand because it was there to watch. The wind blew from the east and tried to steal the smell of labor off the ground she carried loads with. Ankin said little. They folded their words small so no one else could see them. Their bodies made a rhythm, lift, lean, drop. 2 hours in, the pain in Sorrel's chest was not the worst thing. The worst thing was the way the work ate time and left nothing behind. At the edge of the yard, beyond the sleds, the land buckled. Rot teeth stood up waiting for a mouth. Sorrel watched a hawk ride an invisible river over those teeth. It tilted one wing and made the whole sky look like it was turning. She Pike kept them moving. Sorrel watched the men who watched her. Mathers had a tell. When he was tired, he cleared his throat before he spoke. When he was anxious, he bit the inside of his cheek and looked left. When he was bored, he hummed a hymn. That had too much pride in it for a hymn. She stored each piece. At noon, they saw riders, 2 small figures on the south ridge. Far enough the heat made them wobble like bad words. Pike went still in the saddle and lifted his field glass. His jaw did a small, ugly dance. "Scouts," he said, like the word had an insult rolled inside it. "Governors or free quarters?" Mathers asked. Pike snapped the glass shut. "The kind that don't wear colors." "Coyotes," Lute whispered, and Ank, a woman who had taught children what was and was not a coyote, said nothing. The figures did not come closer. They followed at a distance, the way a patient man follows the scent of something he wants to. "Eat." Pike changed their route, as if crossing his own tracks was a way to get out of them. The figures did not care about the route. Until dusk, they rode the ridge as if it was a road only they could see. The night came twitchy. Bodies remember being looked at. The militia took watch in pairs. Pike did his numbers and decided he would not take a watch at all. Sorrel lay with the chain around her wrist and thought of the 2 riders on the ridge. She pictured their hands, their boots, what kind of men wore so much silence. One of them, she decided for no reason she could name, didn't speak if he didn't have to. She liked that. Words were precious and could be hoarded in the right ways. On the morning of the 3rd day, the riders had vanished. It should have made the air softer. It made it worse. The land gave them the line by mid-afternoon without ceremony. One man pointed to a shallow trough running east to west and called it a border. Another man put up a sign with a skull on it, and that made it official. Sorrel had always imagined the line as something you felt in your teeth. Instead, it was exactly like any other stretch of scrub if you looked at it with your eyes. The difference was in how men used it to tell the story of who mattered. "Out," Pike said when they reached the roadworks, the word clipped as a knot. The yard spread before them like an old scar, huts knocked together from planks and stubbornness. A line of rock sleds. Men and women with the color of sleep left on their faces. A foreman with sunburned ears hustled forward, bowing like a boy in a storybook. "Captain Pike," he said. "We're honored." "Put them on rock," Pike said. The 2 women together. "Let the mark breathe." Sorrel stood on the yard with a shovel in her hands and pretended it was a freer thing. Men watched her brand because it was there to watch. The wind blew from the east and tried to steal the smell of labor off the ground she carried loads with. Ankin said little. They folded their words small so no one else could see them. Their bodies made a rhythm, lift, lean, drop. 2 hours in, the pain in Sorrel's chest was not the worst thing. The worst thing was the way the work ate time and left nothing behind. At the edge of the yard, beyond the sleds, the land buckled. Rot teeth stood up waiting for a mouth. Sorrel watched a hawk ride an invisible river over those teeth. It tilted one wing and made the whole sky look like it was turning. She breathed once, honest and deep, and for that heartbeat, she was not a mark. She was a woman under a hawk. "Keating," Mathers said, and her name sounded like a door closing. "Captain wants you." Pike stood in the shade of the foreman's hut as if accepting tribute. "You're strong," he said without looking. At her, "We'll get our year's worth." He stepped in close. "Don't look at the ridge. There's nothing for you there but men with knives. Forget it exists. Women who chase horizons die with their backs exposed." Sorrel looked past him. The ridge ran like the spine of some tired animal. She didn't bother to hide the way she looked. "Someone taught me to never look where I mean to go," she said, calm as water. "So thank you for the reminder." Pike's eyes cooled a degree. "You'll speak when spoken to," he said. "Or not at all." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and if any of your little workyard saints try something for you, remember this. The men who help girls like you always die first. Girls like you. Words some men used when they meant girls with teeth. Sorrel lifted her shovel and went back to the rock. They worked until the sun went carmine on the west lip of the world. The foreman rang a bell that sounded embarrassed by its own thinness. Food, he announced, and the word picked people up and carried them where they had to go. Sorrel's hands shook when she took her bowl. Ank sat with her on a plank and blew on the soup like it was a child's scraped knee. Tonight. Ank said low and without looking. Sorrel sipped and let her body learn the word. You? Ank shook her head once. My legs won't do what I tell them anymore. But I can make someone else's do it. She found Sorrel's eyes. You're not a martyr. You're a woman who wants to live. So be the second thing. Sorrel swallowed. The soup tasted like boiled plans. There are scouts, she said, too cautious to ask. Ank's mouth tucked in at a corner. Sometimes, she said. Sometimes the free quarters eyes. Sometimes men who look at trouble like it's a letter addressed to them. And sometimes. She trailed off, and her eyes did not quite get softer. Sometimes the quiet ones. The camp slept heavy because the day had emptied them out. Pike took the foreman's bed for himself. His men set their tents like they set their jaws square. Too hard. Sorrel lay in a hut with a dozen others and listened to the soft, constant song of exhaustion. 2 bunks over, a woman dreamed of baking and scolded someone for using too much cinnamon. Sorrel stood when she could count 7 steady snores. The kind people only make when they've given everything away. She slid from the hut like a thought you don't want anyone to hear. Ank met her at the plank's edge with a small bundle. Water, she whispered, and willow. And the cloth I'm not supposed to have. She wrapped it around Sorrel's brand tight enough to make Sorrel's eyes jump. If you see a creek, don't trust it. It's probably a map of all the ways water leaves you. Follow rocks, they lie less. Sorrel nodded. Sorrel stared at his hand a moment, longer than a prudent person might allow. The sensible part of her argued in 7 voices. Trap, trick, test, fool. The larger part, the one that had grown teeth not to bite, but to hold on, measured the angle of his body, the way his other hand rested light on the horn, the fact that he had waited to be seen instead of choosing to be feared. She put her palm against his. His skin was calloused in a way that told stories without adjectives. He lifted, and she moved, a single-joined action like a hinge. She felt his strength and the horse's decision and her own lungs agreeing with all of it. Her feet left the ground and the brand burned in a bright line that meant nothing and everything at once. She came down behind him and found the forward pull of his shoulders immediate and unambiguous. Below them, a rock dislodged. It skittered down the outcrop and knocked another loose, and the small sound of it was loud enough to send a prayer scurrying. The men in the wash turned their lantern once, twice in the way cowhands use light to ask if anyone is there. No answer. The rider who had not spoken shifted his weight. The horse understood and began to go. They moved the way owls move, through the space between noise. Sorrel's hands found the old scabbard tied to the saddle and the small notch a careful knife had cut there for a reason. She breathed in the smell of dust that had earned its keep and leather that had done its share. The man's scarf hid his mouth. He glanced back once. Question pressed into the angle of his brow. Sorrel nodded, one sharp piece of punctuation. They had traveled 100 yards, then 100 more, when the wind did a thing Sorrel had feared it would do since she'd left the yard. It turned and carried the memory of her every step in the wrong direction. Behind them, a shout rose. Lanterns changed from suggestion to fact. Pike's men? The bounty riders? The knight didn't care. The rider's hand found Sorrel's and pressed it to the curve where saddle leather became horse. It said, "Hold." It said, "Quiet his weapon." It said, "I am going to spend the rest of what I have left, and I need you to spend yours with me." The ground ahead funneled into a canyonlet barely wide enough for horse. and the bad idea that followed Horse around. Above, rock teeth showed their gums to the moon. Somewhere off to the right, water talked to itself without breath. The rider leaned forward and breathed once like an oath. Shots cracked behind them, one, then three, then a braided chorus. Stones spanged. Sorrel felt the air move at her ear like somebody had asked a rude question there. The silent rider slid his weight again, and the horse flattened itself like a piece of tough cloth laid over bad terrain. They slipped into the cut. The canyon's first bend offered them a little cupboard of safety and a view of its door. The rider drew rein. He still hadn't spoken. He pointed with two fingers back, right, up, and in that small charade, Sorrel understood what he asked her to do. She turned in the saddle and found the shadows that would lie for them. She marked the rock lip that would serve as a doorframe for a miracle. She counted the number of riders by the number of bad decisions they made, and the count kept changing in a way that made her hands sweat. "Who are you?" she whispered before she could force herself not to. It wasn't a door she meant to open, but sometimes wanting to live sounded like a door you couldn't keep shut. He tipped his head as if he'd heard the wind say the same thing. Then he answered, finally, with a voice like the bottom of a well, cool and spare. "Rook." A pause. "Allerton. Rook Allerton." Sorrel turned the name to catch its light. It didn't scream anything. It stood. It suggested a man who moved straight until he needed to move diagonal, and then did that without making a speech about it. Why? Sorrel asked because the brand on her chest had made a hers of what was not hers, and she wanted to own enough of the story to survive it. Rook's profile was a piece of cut tin against the moon. 70 miles, he said. "Can you stay on?" Sorrel blinked. 70, ridge to ridge, he said, to the quarter line. His eyes didn't leave the canyon mouth. "You asked why." "Because after 70, they stop owning what they say you are." His hand flexed on the rein with the kind of gentleness that breaks stone from patience. "Hold." The first riders spilled into the canyon wash like coins no one had asked for. The lantern sketched the walls in yellow-brown. Voices struck and rebounded. Sorrel saw Pike's silhouette, legs too straight for a man who understood. Horses. Mather's square jaw came, loyal and stubborn as a fence post. Behind them, two more men whose hats were the kind men wore when they didn't expect to have to prove anything. "Through there," Pike said. "They're rabbits. Rabbits run for tunnels." Rook touched Sorrel's wrist. "It meant, when I move, we move like we have one body." Pike's horse blew and rolled its eye. Somewhere a gun clacked as an anxious man made himself braver with noise. Sorrel put her palm flat on the horse's side and told her heart to speak quietly. Her brand throbbed. Her lungs asked crude questions about air. She answered them all with yes. Rook's heels touched leather. The horse surged. Sorrel gave herself to the pull, and they were suddenly arrowing through the pinch in the rock, into the startled circle of lantern light, past Pike's boot. Skimming so close, a spur scraped a comet off stone. A man shouted something about ghosts. Another man fired the wrong direction. Rook did not look at any of it. They were a length clear when a rifle cracked, and Sorrel's shoulder felt a hot hand lay itself there and squeeze. She bit down on sound. The canyon ahead fell away into a narrow cleft and the kind of night you could drown in. "Hold." Rook breathed again, voice steady as a taut rope. Sorrel's blood made a wet glove of her shirt. She thought of Ankh sitting up in bed pretending not to think of her. She thought of the hawk, of the ridge, of the way Pike did small ugly dances with his jaw when the world said no to him. She thought of the letter burned into her skin and how that letter thought it could be a sentence. She thought, "Not today." The horse gathered itself. The cleft asked an unreasonable question of it. The lantern behind them flared because men always lift light when the dark asks for a price. Rook's hands moved. Sorrel closed her eyes because sometimes you have to go blind to choose what you see. They launched. For a breathless instant, There was no land. Only a sheet of night and the sound of leather trying to remember how to be a wing. Sorrel felt the whole world make a decision beneath her. She pulled air into her lungs, and the air carried the smell of rain from somewhere impossible. The horse landed hard and true, and pain spiked white at her shoulder where the bullet had kissed. Behind them, men skidded to the edge and cursed gravity for being so old. Rook leaned low, hand to the horse's neck, and the animal lengthened as if it had stolen more distance than any horse had a right to steal. The canyon opened into a black plain peppered with basalt, like a giant had salt in his hand and was careless with it. Rook turned the horse into that emptiness like a man turning a page. Somewhere behind, Pike gave the order that men give when they have to live later with the fact that a legend grew. A new beginning right under their noses. Sorrel tasted iron and called it something else. She tightened her grip with her right hand because her left wouldn't. Rook did not look back. He did not speak. He rode in the clean, relentless way of a man who had decided to spend everything on one thing. 70 miles, he had said. She pressed her cheek to his back, closed her eyes a moment against the sky, and told herself a simple truth she could carry farther than any chain. Every mile is a verb. And she was not a mark. She was the one who chose them. They rode into the basalt, into the wind that had decided to push instead of hinder, into a night that stretched in front of them like an unbroken promise, and a lantern kindled on their left very close, much closer than it had any right to be, the pale circle cutting the dark in half as a voice she knew too well drawled, almost pleasant with triumph. There you are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Better than letting someone else own them, she said. And only after the words were out did she realize she had made a joke. She let it sit between them. It didn't suffer the night. The first gray made itself known in the east like a debt collector. Rook stopped them where a wind-thrown cedar had come to rest under a lip of stone. The place had found them the way places do when you admit you need them. He tied the gelding with enough slack to sleep his head low and pulled a blanket from the roll. He stretched it but didn't offer it. He looked at Sorrel to see if she would ask. She didn't. She waited. He tipped one corner in her direction. She took it. They sat with their backs to the same rock and did a thing the body calls rest even. When the mind can't afford the word, 2 minutes, Sorrel thought, were a luxury. She took 4. The brand was a warm coin at her chest. The bullet graze was the edge of a word she didn't know how to spell yet. She woke to Rook's breath against her ear. He didn't shake her. He didn't call her name. He breathed a syllable into the air that was equal parts warning and invitation. She opened her eyes and the light had become a soft, indifferent thing that showed everything without trying to make you feel about it. Dust rose in the south, a pale thread. Rook's eyes were on it. He had a way of looking that made distance think twice about existing. He put 2 fingers flat on her forearm. A question. She nodded. He stood without using his hands. The horse did the same, made of the same economy. They followed the arroyo until it forked and then took the fork that felt more like a secret. Rook set the gelding to a trot that had no hurry in it, but covered ground anyway. Sorrel's shoulder nagged. She fixed the brand beneath the cloth. Ank had given and felt a spiteful pleasure hiding the governor's letter from the sun-dotted a dry fall. Rook dismounted and handed her the reins. He climbed it the way water climbs nothing, and then turned and reached. She set her boot in a notch and put her good palm into his, and felt strength go both directions. She found breath laughing at her again and told it there were jokes later. They topped out into a basin studded with chert and old coyote prints. A windmill's skeleton stood a quarter-mile off, throwing a shadow that belonged to someone alive. Sorrel pictured underground water, pipe rust, the way iron shaves itself into teeth when no one's looking. Rook did not go to it. He arced around like a cautious planet. She wanted to ask why, and then saw it. Two men's silhouettes low inside the broken tank. Ambush without patience. She put her breath back in its drawer and kept it there. By noon, the heat had learned their names and was saying them too often. Rook shaded the horse in a slot of rock long enough to count 50 heartbeats. He loosened the girth and checked the gelding's hooves. "Left 4, he said. Stone took a bite. Sorrel looked and saw it, a bright line at the edge where shoe met hoof, a thinness that made a future problem if you were sloppy. Rook wasn't sloppy. He drew a spare shoe from a saddlebag that shouldn't have had one and a small hammer that made no more noise than the word it took to decide to use it. He held the hoof between his knees the way farriers do, steady and sure, and swapped the shoe while the gelding breathed into his shoulder. "Where did you learn to do everything?" she asked, because sometimes wonder earns the right to be spoken aloud. "Wrong places," he said. "Long enough to learn. Short enough to leave." She wanted to ask what he'd left, and who, and whether the leaving had been the right kind, or only the kind a man can stand to tell a stranger. She didn't. The wind was listening and had a habit of selling words to men who thought they could afford them. They moved. The dust to the south wrote their pursuers' intentions in a careful hand. The line to the north wrote a promise in a tighter one. Rook kept them between letters. He cut sign with his eyes and unspooled miles out of stubborn earth. Sorrel started to feel the number 70 like a bead on a string she could thumb well. Thinking of something else. "That Pan woman," Rook said after a long quiet that had done its job. "She said you were branded for refusing a levy." "I refused a man pretending to be a levy," Sorrel said. The words tasted like 3-day-old coffee and resolve. He wanted men. He asked for boys. He asked for crops that weren't ripe. Then for wheels that weren't his. Then for names that weren't his to say. He came to my door and asked for the door. Rook's profile did not change, but his hand on the rein tightened. "And you said no." "I said he could have the broom if he could take it from me." Sorrel blinked against sun. "He took the broom, then asked for everything the broom touched. I took it back." She breathed once. "I didn't hit him. As hard as I wanted." Rook's mouth made something that might have been a smile in a different man. Hard enough to need a brand. Hard enough to remind him his mouth had limits. She looked at the rim of hills that held the north like a hand. "He brought pike men to tell me my hands had limits too." "They don't," Rook said, as easily as stating that a rock was not a river. "They'll try to make a shape fit you. They'll fail." Sorrel swallowed. Praise from him felt like a tool issued under signature. "You didn't use it to decorate a wall. You put it in your belt for when something needed an edge." The afternoon leaned toward meaner heat. They cut across a varnished slope where ancient water had smoothed lava into a black tongue. Tracks would hold here like grudges. Rook wrapped the gelding's feet in sacking long enough to leave a lie and led him in a fishbone pattern. He took a branch and brushed what needed forgetting. Sorrel learned a thing about a racing without pretending it. Had never been docked by late light. They found a draw thick with rabbit brush that solved their thirst and hid the solution. Rook dug in a certain place as if the earth had sent him an invitation. With a map. His hands found a buried jug neck exactly where some ancestor of his hope had left it. The water inside tasted of clay and stubbornness and life you didn't know anyone else. He let the horse drink, then Sorrel, then himself. Then poured a thumb's worth on the gelding's withers, because a horse's skin thinks with you when you think with it. "Sleep," he said, and then, because she did not immediately obey, "I'll take the first watch. You take the second. Wake me with a foot to the boot if there's need." Sorrel lay down with the blanket half over her and rolled her face to the dirt. Dirt smells like a place that existed before orders. She let the smell remind her she had existed before Pike. She floated, then sank, then came up hard when a sound like metal thinking too loudly clicked in the brush behind them. She rose to a crouch and put her fingers on Rook's boot without having to look for it. He was already looking. His hand closed around the rifle that had slept along his leg as if it were another bone. He did not aim into the sound. He waited for the sound to choose whether it wanted to be honest. A feral pig pushed its face out of the brush, ugly and efficient, and offended that the world liked other animals better. It sniffed, decided Rook and Sorrel were not acorns, and moved along. Sorrel's breath, held tight in her fist, loosened one finger. "Wake me next time anyway," Rook said in a voice you could pour fence posts with. "Pigs get bored and make bad decisions. I've met men like that," Sorrel muttered. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his eye looked a little less tired. Her watch passed measured by stars. A waterbird flew in the dark, too high and too hopeful for a place so stingy. She thought of Ank's hands and Morel's voice, and the way Mathers had bitten his cheek at the yard. The tell of a man who was not stone enough to do his job without bleeding a little under it. She hoped the bit place hurt him. She hoped it taught him something. Hope is cheap and expensive that way. Just before dawn, a coyote sang a 3-note line that meant something like "We all eat what we can." Sorrel thought, 70. Rook breathed. The horse dreamed, feet flicking against a ground that had turned forgiving for it. They moved at first gray, keeping to shade that didn't exist yet, except in Rook's head. Sorrel's shoulder had gone stiff and opinionated. Rook cut her a willow switch and told her to keep it moving. "Blood's a mule when it sulks," he said. "Make it step up." She did, and Payne took that as permission to argue less. The world narrowed to the width of the path they had chosen, and then widened without, warning into a view that stole breath from the horse, as well as the humans on it. The land fell away into a basin the color of old brass. A crooked line of cottonwoods marked where a river persisted in being, even when it forgot how. Between them and the far rim sprawled a braid of mud, stone, water, and places that only pretended to be any of those things. Rook saw it and changed his breathing. Sorrel felt the change like a tremor you tell yourself is a truck until the dishes say otherwise. "Half the distance," he said. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even news. It was inventory. They took the slope down in a switchback that had been sketched by goats and revised by desperate men. Near the bottom, the ground slicked under the top grace of damp. Rook dismounted and led the gelding, letting his own boots take the risk. Sorrel followed with her hand on the horse's hip. She felt the animal think its way down. At the river, honest water in honest motion, Rook stopped and let the day arrive around them. The cottonwoods clapped like old women at a child's first steps. Dark fish wrote their names near the bank, then pretended they had not. "Cross above the bend," Rook said. "Below looks easy." It's not. Afternoon pressed heat into their backs and tried to shove their heads down. Rook fought it with shade and pace and the way he spent water. Twice he slipped the gelding's bridle and let the horse graze saltweed long enough to remember what mouths are for besides bits and breathing. Twice he picked stones from hooves before the horse remembered to limp. The second time he set the hoof down slow and listened. His face turned to some math only he knew how to do. 2 more miles, he said. Then we blow the stink off, and then we climb. Climb what? Sorrel asked, and the answer arrived a minute later when the ground admitted an escarpment it had been hiding, an ash-gray wall laced with switchbacks, like a seamstress's mistakes. At the top, the world looked like a hand cupped around a secret. They started up. The switchbacks were honest in that they didn't pretend to be anything but work. Sorrel's breath found a rhythm, old friend of hike and hoe and haste. The shoulder made itself known, and then made itself useful holding pain in one place, so the rest of her could be good at other things. Rook didn't speak. He saved words and oxygen for when they did more than decorate. 3 turns from the top. The gelding stopped, not a refusal, a statement. Rook put his hand on the wither and let weight go into horse and horse into him. "All right," he told it. "You did what I asked when I asked. You tell me now if I'm asking wrong." The gelding sighed. Rook let it steal 4 more breaths than he'd planned. He was a man who changed plans without apology when the truth earned the right to be in charge. They crested. The view from the rim punched a sound out of Sorrel she did not know she'd been saving. The north lay iron smooth, grass plains pale as old paper, a ribbon of trees that had earned their green, far off a smear of blue that might be a lake or a boast. And there in the middle distance, a palisade like a stitch across the land, not a city wall, not a fort, a thing that looked more like a promise somebody had made and then kept building until it felt true. Rook saw it and made, his mouth a straighter. "Line, quarter guardway," he said. "Pickets on the near side sometimes. Depends who's in a mood. Are moods better than orders?" Sorrel asked. "Sometimes they rhyme," he said. "Sometimes they cancel." They cut toward it, holding the higher ground where grass hid them from the sort of men who only look in straight lines. The air changed. It did that sometimes near borders. Something in the way men and maps meet makes the wind carry more decisions. In it, Sorrel could feel the horse's ears listening to ground and sky both, triangulating a safety that did not yet exist. They had covered a mile of the last 2 when the wind did its trick again. It swung, took everything that had been traveling with them, and handed it to someone else. Sorrel heard it before she saw it, the hard-edged rattle of spurs used by men who thought sound made fear, the chuff of a careless horse's feet. She looked left, and the land resolved into riders coming up out of a draw like a row of ill-chosen. Words. Pike. 5 with him. Mathers at his right, jaw set so hard it had made a duty of itself. Behind, 2 men with yellow dust in their hatbands, bounty or worse. On the outside flank, a boy with a face that wanted to be older so it wouldn't have to admit anything. "There you are," Pike called again, almost delighted with himself for making the sane line work twice. Roads always end at gates. Rook didn't look at Sorrel. He didn't need to. "Down," he said, and the word landed exactly where her bones needed it. She slid from the saddle. He pressed the reins into her hand like a live thing and nudged the gelding's hip with his knee. The horse moved off, the suggestion of rider on its back remaining true enough for a man to aim at. Rook slipped into the grass like he had been a blade once and remembered it. He moved with the kind of certainty that looked quiet from the outside and like a storm from the inside. Sorrel crouched, breath tree-high in her throat, and watched Pike's men fan. The draw gave them a funnel, whether they wanted one or not. Rook took the funnel and made it sting. 2 shots, quick and clean, sent the flanking men's horses crabbing sideways and unseated the boy with the face he couldn't carry yet. Not killing. Not mercy either. Geometry. Pike answered with flourish and lead. His shot chewed a grass clump a yard from Sorrel's boot and told her he was either being honest with his aim or not as good as his uniform. Mathers held his fire until he saw something that wanted to be a target. That was a man Sorrel could almost understand. "Bring the girl," Pike barked. "Shoot the horse." Rook moved. He didn't run, he flowed. He drew fire away from Sorrel, the way a slope draws water. Pike turned to follow the bigger problem, forgetting that big problems often grow from small ones when you look away. Sorrel rose 3 inches, enough to be something the horse could find. She made herself grass in motion and passed under the gelding's neck and came up on the far side and felt this. The moment when an animal chooses to believe in you because you did a thing you had no business doing and you didn't break the belief when you landed. "Easy," she told the gelding, and the word made the horse's ribs soften against her forearm. She slid the reins over his head and moved with him toward the rim where they could drop into the braids of low gullies. A bullet whined where their shadows had been. She did not look back. She did not look down. She looked where Rook would want the road to be, and found it because he had trained the world to have it there for him. Pike realized his mistake a breath later. "Keating," he shouted, all velvet burnt-off wire. "Stop!" The word did not come with the force he believed it contained. Words are like coins, you can only spend what you've earned. Sorrel did not stop. The gullies received her, and the horse like secret family. She felt the ground's memory under her boots. It remembered hooves from a week ago, a year ago, a war ago. She thought, let the quarter remember me as a woman who learned to read ground in 3 days because 3 days is what she had been given. Rook fell back toward her, not like a retreat, but like a drawstring closing the bag at exactly the right time. He slid into the gully a body length behind and to her right, used its turn to break sight lines, and cuffed the gelding's shoulder just enough to remind him the world outside his eyes still existed. Good, he said to Sorrel, and the word ran the length of her spine like a hand. Gate in 2, he added, breath even. We go under it, under? She echoed, because gates were built to insult ideas like under. Flood culvert, he said. Old iron. Quarter got tired of men pretending water was law and cut a hole for it. No one likes to get their belly wet. They forget. A horn blew from the fence ahead, a flat, impatient sound with no one's heart in it. A man's voice shouted a question that the wind didn't bother to carry to them. Pike's answer came hard and precious. They've stolen a prisoner. Open. Rook didn't bother to tell the fencemen their mistake. He cut left, then right, following a path that looked like nothing anyone had ever wanted to follow. Sorrel felt the air change cooler, closer. The gully became a trench. The trench became a narrow throat in stone. The throat led to a mouth choked with wire and willow and a rust smell that was not poetic. Rook tossed the rifle into Sorrel's hands. Hold, he said, and dived into the mouth as if it were the only right thing to do. He didn't cut wire. He found where someone else had cut and someone else had fixed lazily. He levered, pried, bent until the world remembered its hinge. He shoved the willow aside, and the culvert showed its round black laugh. Lead the head, he said of the horse, and Sorrel did, and the gelding lowered without argument because Rook had taught him that lower was a kind of forward too. Water glazed the culvert's floor in a skin that pretended to be nothing. Then turned ankles slick when you believed it. Sorrel didn't believe it. She bent, hand on the horse's halter, shoulder a live coal, brand a bad word, and moved. The culvert narrowed where men had been cheap with their shovel. The horse's ribs brushed rust. The clang was quiet because the culvert had learned to keep men's secrets, or maybe it had made enough of its own to know the value of silence. Halfway through, the world above them changed. Feet pounded close enough to call a name and expect to get it right. Pike's voice hit the mouth of the culvert and broke its teeth there. Block the end, he shouted. Smoke them. Smoke. Sorrel's body remembered river loss, remembered rooms that filled with the wrong thing. Panic tried to write itself on the inside of her ribs. She took the chalk from its hand and wrote other words. Forward, crawl, alive. She breathed shallow and timed it with the gelding so the horse would think she was brave and become it. Light ahead grew into a coin again. Rook's boots sloshed into the coin first. He came up in a shallow basin where willow hid how poor the water here had become. He hauled the willow back with one hand and the horse's head with the other and made both think the move had been their idea. They burst out into a pocket between the Sate-Ho quarter's outer ditch and a stand of wild rye. Men atop the palisade pointed and argued the way men do when the book they've been taught doesn't match the world their eyes bring them. Rook took in the realities. The ditch too wide to jump here. The rye thick enough to hide a sin. Wavegard on the left had his rifle on the rail, and the one on the right hadn't bothered and aimed for the right because laziness is a kind of invitation you should RSVP to quickly. Hold there, a voice called from above. Identify yourselves, Rook Allerton, Rook said without looking up. His voice fit the name like a hand in a glove that had already earned its creases. Clearway runner, 2 pulls, 3 smoke. 1 mark, Pike double quotes, the guard's head tilted. "A pike, Captain," Rook said. "Blue-gray and mostly starch." A different head replaced the first at the parapet, this one with gray. In the beard and eyes that had towed lines and drawn them too. "You aim to bring the governor's temper to our ditch?" he called. "No," Rook said. "Just his mistake." He nodded once at Sorrel. "Keating. Brand for refusing a levy." "That wasn't. Midwife sent sign." On the guardway, the argument changed shape. It stopped being about whether to follow the book and started being about which page. The graybeard made a choice. He kicked someone out of his way whose boots showed more Polish than work. "Gate team," he bellowed. "South culvert cover. And if anyone blows smoke into that hole, I'll put him in a barrel and roll him home." "Sir," someone said in the tone of a man who hadn't been allowed to be a person for months and had just been given permission. Pike's men hit the fence line on the far side of the ditch at the run. Bare ground skidding under boots. Mather's face showed at the lip of the culvert they just used, eyes red with surprise that the world contained solutions he hadn't been warned about. Pike came up a second later, took in the gate above, the guards on it, Rook and Sorrel in the pocket below, and made a sound like a hinge that wanted to be a door. By authority of Governor May, he shouted, "You will turn over the fugitive." Branded R for rebellion and the man who stole her. He made his voice large. Men on small horses make their voices large when they don't know what else to widen. By authority of people not being fools, the gray beard called back, "You can keep your voice on your side of the ditch." He looked down at Rook, cross. "Here, and it makes a trouble I can't unmake." "You know the place." Rook nodded once. "North," he said to Sorrel. "Quarter rope bridge." "Rope," she repeated, and her palms began to itch because rope does that to a woman who has fallen off too many things in the dull parts of her life. They ran bent, using rye for their idea of invisibility, and the rye did its part. Bullets tore complications into the air 2 feet above them. Pike kept up the shouting because men had died when he shouted before, and habits are strong. The ground dropped in a way that wanted to be a gift. Rook took it without saying thank you, a cut gully that ran parallel to the palisade, and then, just where you'd think it abandoned you, veered under a tumble of rock and came out at a ravine that bit into the earth like a mouth with bad teeth. Across that mouth, 50 feet away and a lifetime, a rope bridge slung low between 2 old cottonwood stumps. It had been made by men with more nerve than twine. Its planks were narrow and believed in each other more than they believed in the people who stepped on them. The far side rose toward a second ditch cut with purpose. Beyond that, the open plain, the promise Rook had refused to name a promise. Guards. Above scrambled like men trying to be useful. One ran with a crank that looked like it belonged to a different problem. Another shouted something about counterweights. The gray beard appeared again, now at a lower door tucked into the palisades. "Seam. Bridge swings," he yelled. "You catch it on the forward." Rook didn't wait. He slid down the gully's last bite and hit the ravine lip at a lean. He handed Sorrel the reins and then, without ceremony, the horse itself, putting the gelding's nose in her chest hard enough to force them to root in the same place. "Take him across first," he said. "Keep your eyes on the knot. Left hand low. If he drops, drop the rope. Rope takes what believes in it too much." "Rook, you go first," he said, and it was not an argument but a principle. "I'm heavier and I make worse decisions when I'm under you." It was not until later that Sorrel understood what he'd given away there. In the moment, the ravine had other kinds of teeth. She put her boot on the first plank and made that plank. Believed she knew where she was aiming. The horse blew hot. She told him something calm with her breath. He put a foot on the second plank like a man trying out a new word. They moved. The bridge dipped and protested and then accepted the work. Rope sang a complaint. The far cottonwood stump creaked with its own history. Halfway, the wind remembered its talent for changing gods. It swung, the bridge swayed, Sorrel's stomach chased it. She didn't look down, she put her eyes on the knot Rook had named. She sang to the horse under her breath about biscuits and brooms. She didn't know the words until she needed them. And then they were there. A shot cracked from the near side pike, impatient with geometry. The bullet took a plank 3 feet in front of Sorrel and made it into a metaphor. She stepped over and asked the horse to fly, and he did, because faith has a hoof size too. Behind, Rook stepped onto the bridge, and the ropes made a sound all their own. On the palisade, men worked the crank. The bridge swung a foot toward the far side, then another, the counterweight catching, releasing. The number 10 hemp on the east anchor cried out, or some fool had cinched it hard on a hot day and let it cool without loosening the knot. "Don't look down," Rook said, calm as if he were commenting on soup. Sorrel didn't. She put her boot on the plank that came next, like it was the last plank in the world and therefore the most important. The horse followed and did not argue, which is how you know an animal has decided to be better than you deserve. The far stump rose toward them like a friend making himself larger so the crowd can find him. 50 feet, 40, 30, on the near bank, Pike swung his rifle to a different angle. Not at Sorrel, not at Rook, at the east anchor. At the knot that was a fool's night leftover in cool weather. Sorrel saw the angle as the same instant as Rook did. Her mouth opened. His hand was already moving. He fired. The ball snapped Pike's hat off and took a piece of his pride with it. Pike fired anyway. The bullet hit the knot like a man tapping a drunk on the shoulder. The rope held because rope holds. Then a strand inside cut where it had been waiting to quit since a winter nobody remembered. Then another. The rope spat fibers. Like a cattail in wind. "Sorrel," Rook called. The first time he had said her name, it was an order he had given himself. "Run now." She ran. The horse ran with her. The bridge jerked sideways like a fish on a line in wrong hands. The far stump groaned. The near anchor screamed. Above, the gray beard threw his weight into a lever and swore in a language that belonged to men who built things. Instead of breaking them, 20 feet, 15, the rope sound went from complaint to prophecy. The world held its breath, because the world loves a good drop as much as men do. Sorrel jumped the last 2 planks, and the horse came with heart and hoof and holy stubbornness. Her boots hit dirt. The geldings for hooves scrabbled for purchase and found it. She turned, breath like fire in a tin can, and saw Rook at the center. 1 foot already past where Pike had tried to make nothingness, the other committing to follow, every muscle in his life answering the same question. The rope at the near anchor let go. The bridge dropped. To give the only thing they couldn't take from her, her name. "My name is Sorrel Keating," she said, voice steady despite the breath that wanted to dodge. "I claim quarter under the rule of 2 pulls, then 3. Branded for refusing. A levy that wasn't a levy. This man," she tilted her chin toward the one who had become an argument with gravity and won, "is Rook Allerton." He answered smoke. The rifle at her cheek did not move. The soldier behind it had the sort of posture that believed form was a hinge that could hold a whole world. Up close, Sorrel saw freckles across a nose that would always be a little too proud for its owner's good. A woman, young enough to still think rules were elder kin to mercy. Her sleeves bore quarter gray with a patch that said Tollstone. Gate in letters that didn't waste themselves on flourish. "State your claim," the soldier repeated, as if Sorrel had not already done it. "Stated," Rook said behind her. From the parapet above, the gray-bearded officer leaned into view, hands braced on the rail. The lines around his mouth suggested he had taught too many boys to be men with only a gate and a list for tools. "You're not the one I asked," he barked at the soldier, and his voice had the exact gravel of a creek bed in drought. "Stand them down, Loke." The soldier, the name fit her mouth, Tamsin Loke blinked, then obeyed like a door at the exact moment it learns it has always been a door. She eased the muzzle away an inch. Not apology, adjustment. Sorrel let her hands fall to where the shoulder would still be honest. Grey Sergeant Oran Shaw. The grey-beard introduced himself, as if he preferred people to call him by work that could get banged up and still be useful. Quarter Guardway. If you're going to make me write paperwork, I like to know what names I'm spelling. He's lying, Pike called from the near bank, his voice a polished boot that wanted to stay on the table it had been put on. He had retrieved his hat, and the shred of pride Rook's shot had cut off it, either by force or by telling himself a story. Keating is under sentence. The man with her is a thief of government property. Is the woman government property? Now? Shaw asked dryly, and those on the parapet who were still allowed the hobby of amusement let sound escape them in a way that had not been permitted at this ditch for some time. She is under the governor's seal, came a new voice, crisp enough to cut paper without folding it. And she has been since the winter floods at Weirbridge. Sorrel didn't mean to turn toward that voice. Her body did it for her, like a weed turning its leaf to a light it wished wasn't there. The envoy had ridden up to Pike's right with a pace that did not borrow drama, blue-gray tailored where Pike's was merely well cut. She held her banner the way some women held a knitting needle, busy fingers with consequences. The wind decided to cooperate with her rather than with anyone else, which was a wind's kind of flattery. Hevila Crane, Sorrel said, not meaning to say the name aloud and saying it anyway. The taste was pewter in her mouth, old and serviceable. And not quite clean. The envoy lifted one corner of her mouth. It would have been a smile somewhere else. You remember, she said, projecting not to Sorrel but to the whole ditch and the men who needed to hear what remembering made of them. We met when the river introduced your town to the notion of leaving. You were a head count and 2 blankets. As I recall. Sorrel's cheeks felt hot in a way that had nothing to do with the day. The winter Crane spoke of had been a lesson in cold and inventory, and the kind of kindness given in weighed handfuls. Men from the governor's office had come in with clipboards and faces that matched them. They had counted mouths and decided which ones could be fed without spoiling the math. Sorrel, 12 and knife-hungry, had learned what her name sounded like, shouted by a man who didn't bother to look up when he called it. Crane had been there, a junior ledger then, writing what other men told her to write. She had looked Sorrel in the eye exactly once and said, 2 blankets, 1 smaller, no starch. Sorrel had hated Crane for remembering that, even as she hated the river for having the same sharp memory. Now Crane sat a saddle like a fact and addressed the wall. Quarter Guardway Sergeant Shaw, is it? By the terms of the Badwater Accord, Section 3, Clause 9, you are obliged to return branded fugitives when lawfully demanded by a sworn officer under mark. She touched a wax seal at her breast, like a woman who knew her jewelry could. Order funerals. I demand the return of Sorrel Keating and detainment of the man who aided her escape. Shaw removed his hands from the rail as if they were heavy and movement took thought. He did not look at Sorrel or at Rook. He looked along the whole scene as if measuring whether the day could carry any more consequence or whether it had taken its full share. That's one reading, he said. It's the reading, Crane. Returned. Accords have more than one word in them, Shaw replied. They say what you say, Madam Envoy. And they also say we accept those who claim quarter under smoke sign when a midwife signals a levy gone sour. 2 pulls, then 3 is. Trouble with a capital T. Your governor's men have obliged us to memorize that clause better than the rest. Pike made a sound in his throat. It wanted to be a warning. It came out a cough. These 2 are criminals. These 2 are my inventory until I decide they're otherwise, Shaw said. He turned and nodded to the gate team. Down the culvert bowl. Rope the pocket. Get them to the house. Tamsin Loke motioned with the rifle in a way that meant forward, not fear. Rook touched Sorrel's elbow, question ready. And when she gave him the nod that was both answer and vow, he rose. The gelding blew and shook and decided to be a better animal than the day deserved. They moved as a knot, 2 people, 1 horse, a small caravan of breath and decision, toward a door set into the palisade the way a scar is set into skin. On the near bank, Crane's banner leaned as if curious. Pike tried the volume of his voice. "On Shaw's back one last time. You will answer for this. Aiding fugitives, interference, theft of sentence." Shaw didn't turn. "Sir," he called in the tone of a schoolmaster whose patience had passed saving, "I will be answering for the gate I am paid to keep, which includes the part where I decide who dies under it. You will, I'm sure, find plenty to answer. For on your own side of the ditch," the door swallowed them. The world changed temper. Inside the gatehouse, the light was the color of paper old men fold their maps out of, yellow, practical, a little tired. A long table held ink and a bowl of water and a loaf that had been forgotten when something more urgent stood up. On one wall, a chalkboard listed switches and watches and a reminder, in someone's patient hand, to oil the south crank before it became another lecture. Shaw came through a different door and set his hat on a peg. Without the hat, his hair was a gray that had started life the color grass gets when it thinks it's going to be stepped on again. He looked at Sorrel and at Rook the way carpenters look at a beam they are going to trust their houses to. "Sit," he said to Sorrel. To Rook, "Stand where she can see you." Tamsin Loke moved around like a hinge that wanted to learn how to be a window too. She took the gelding's reins from Sorrel and caught the horse's eye long enough to make a contract with it without language. She didn't smile, but some small fraction of her face stopped bracing for impact. "Loke," Shaw said without looking away from Sorrel's brand, "fetch Morel Pan's note. She's got her fingers in this. You know Morel?" Sorrel asked, surprised into it before she could put the words back in their drawer. "Midwives know gates," Shaw said. "Gates know midwives. We both keep count of who belongs to whom." He leaned into the wound at Sorrel's shoulder and looked at it without making her feel like a wall to be inspected. "Graze," he announced, "clean." He tossed a chin at a young man whose face had not yet gotten used to whiskers. "Rennet boil, cloth, willow. Should be moving again before the ink dries." Rennet moved the way boys do when they are still surprised they are allowed to be men. He set water on the little iron stove, the concentration of a man who believes heat will notice if you don't show it respect. Sorrel breathed through a wash of pain and counted the cracks in the table with the kind of attention you give to anything that is not your own skin. "I know Crane," Shaw said, as if answering a question she hadn't dared to ask. "She's the governor's clean knife. Sends letters that arrive before the horses should be able to bring them. Keeps books like enemies. At Weirbridge, she found 3 pallets and a tent nobody else would find for love or money, because she thinks the world is tidier if people don't die on her watch." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Her tidy and my tidy make different kinds of floors." Sorrel met his gaze. "She will try to make me an example." "Examples make for poor shelves," Shaw said. "They hold nothing anyone wants to keep." He scratched something on a paper with a pencil that had been sharpened with a knife. "Allerton?" Rook stepped into one square of sunlight that slanted down from a window high in the wall. Dust made scripture there, a language Shaw's men kept by moving in it. Rook's face looked carved more than usual. His left hand flexed once. The fingers that had held the plank knew the Book of Weight by heart. "Rook Allerton," he said. "Clearway runner. Contracted on smoke, 70 miles. 70? Shaw's eyebrows lifted enough to make his forehead look like a more complicated country. "You aiming for a particular door?" "Red post," Rook answered. "Ridge to ridge." Crane answered. Her words were measured and hard, stacked like bricks you cannot move without gaining bruises. She spoke of order and the way a levied road fed the quarter's own trade. How one woman's no could turn a whole wagon line's worth of yes into spoiled bread. She painted Pike's orders as a dull blade misused rather than a bright knife used wrong. She pressed the seal against the afternoon with each sentence until the day had marks on it, from where she'd tried to make it. Behave, Rook was asked one. Question: Did you take a woman out of the governor's yard against his mark? He answered in a voice that didn't take a step it didn't mean to take. I took a woman out of a yard on smoke drawn by a midwife for a levee that used the wrong nouns. The bell swayed once on a breeze no one else felt. Reader Galen listened the way someone listens for a baby's first breath and its second. She wrote small children of their words in her book. She asked Mathers for a sentence and got a whole paragraph of duty, trying to unlearn shame. She didn't shame him. She made the words find their own feet. Shaw stood with his hat in his hands and watched the horizon for other kinds of trouble. Loke watched Pike with the kind of attention you give snakes in late spring when they're just warm enough to mean it again. Rennet fell in love with the bell and the way it had decided never to ring for anything silly. In the end, Galen closed. The book, the noise it made was not final, it was faithful. By smoke and by midwife, I read the brand invalid under quarter. Pike spluttered a sentence he had hoped not to use so soon. Crane didn't splutter. She became still the way water goes iron under frost. And under clause 9, she asked. Galen breathed. The pen waited in her fingers, invoked and recorded. Reserved until the quarter's own ask is done. The ask is done when? Crane answered. Her words were measured and hard, stacked like bricks you cannot move without gaining bruises. She spoke of order and the way a levied road fed the quarter's own trade, how one woman's no could turn a whole wagon line's worth of yes into spoiled bread. She painted Pike's orders as a dull blade misused rather than a bright knife used wrong. She pressed the seal against the afternoon with each sentence until the day had marks on it, from where she'd tried to make it. Behave, Rook was asked one. Question: Did you take a woman out of the governor's yard against his mark? He answered in a voice that didn't take a step it didn't mean to take. I took a woman out of a yard on smoke drawn by a midwife for a levee that used the wrong nouns. The bell swayed once on a breeze no one else felt. Reader Galen listened the way someone listens for a baby's first breath and its second. She wrote small children of their words in her book. She asked Mathers for a sentence and got a whole paragraph of duty, trying to unlearn shame. She didn't shame him. She made the words find their own feet. Shaw stood with his hat in his hands and watched the horizon for other kinds of trouble. Loke watched Pike with the kind of attention you give snakes in late spring when they're just warm enough to mean it again. Rennet fell in love with the bell and the way it had decided never to ring for anything silly. In the end, Galen closed. The book, the noise it made was not final, it was faithful. By smoke and by midwife, I read the brand invalid under quarter. Pike spluttered a sentence he had hoped not to use so soon. Crane didn't splutter. She became still the way water goes iron under frost. And under clause 9, she asked. Galen breathed. The pen waited in her fingers, invoked and recorded. Reserved until the quarter's own ask is done. The ask is done when? Crane pressed because women like Crane do not stop when they need to be invited out. When you have put this girl beyond easy reach. When we have put her where the reading does not, Crane answered. Her words were measured and hard, stacked like bricks you cannot move without gaining bruises. She spoke of order and the way a levied road fed the quarter's own trade, how one woman's no could turn a whole wagon line's worth of yes into spoiled bread. She painted Pike's orders as a dull blade misused rather than a bright knife used wrong. She pressed the seal against the afternoon with each sentence until the day had marks on it, from where she'd tried to make it. Behave, Rook was asked one. Question: Did you take a woman out of the governor's yard against his mark? He answered in a voice that didn't take a step it didn't mean to take. I took a woman out of a yard on smoke drawn by a midwife for a levee that used the wrong nouns. The bell swayed once on a breeze no one else felt. Reader Galen listened the way someone listens for a baby's first breath and its second. She wrote small children of their words in her book. She asked Mathers for a sentence and got a whole paragraph of duty, trying to unlearn shame. She didn't shame him. She made the words find their own feet. Shaw stood with his hat in his hands and watched the horizon for other kinds of trouble. Loke watched Pike with the kind of attention you give snakes in late spring when they're just warm enough to mean it again. Rennet fell in love with the bell and the way it had decided never to ring for anything silly. In the end, Galen closed the book. The noise it made was not final, it was faithful. By Smoke and by Midwife, I read The Brand Invalid under quarter. Pike spluttered a sentence he had hoped not to use so soon. Crane didn't splutter. She became still the way water goes iron under frost. And under clause 9, she asked. Galen breathed. The pen waited in her fingers, invoked and recorded. Reserved until the quarter's own ask is done. The ask is done when? Crane pressed because women like Crane do not stop when they need to be invited out. When you have put this girl beyond easy reach. When we have put her where the reading does not depend on which men at which gate had the least sleep, Galen said. When the day doesn't feel like it owes anyone anything. When paper weighs more than rifles. By when? Crane insisted, clean and surgical. Galen looked up at the sky as if it were a ledger with less sense than it pretended. Tomorrow's third hour, she said. Red Post House with 2 other readers, under bell. Crane's eyes flicked to Shaw, to Rook, to Sorrel, to the road. And tonight? Tonight, Galen said. You will not cross our ditch unless we invite you. She nodded once to Shaw. And you, Sergeant, will put your feet under the woman and the runner and move them to a place men cannot petition them with rifles. Shaw looked put upon in a way that was mostly theater. We'll dig a hole in a hill and call it hospitality, he said. To Sorrel and Rook, we move. They left Red Post under a gift of provender and the bad math of more miles. The sun tilted toward the part of the day that makes promises it cannot keep. Shaw led them along a ridge that had decided not to worry about erosion yet. He took a deer track that knew a cave, and the cave turned out to be more an idea than a hole in old lava tube, with one end curled up like a sleeping dog. Here, Shaw said, I've slept less comfortably. He set Loke and Rennet out in the sage with instructions that sounded like chores and were, in fact, professions. He put his back against the tube's mouth and set his rifle across his knees like a man who played cards against men who didn't know when to fold. Inside, the air smelled like ancient fire and new dust. Rook eased the gelding into the shadow and let the animal consider the proposition of being inside the earth without complaint. The horse decided it would accept this once. Sorrel sat. The stone at her back felt like a spine she could borrow until her own remembered how. Why 70? She asked when Quiet had had a chance to soften the sharp edges. You said it like a vow. Rook sat across from her, hands busy with an old piece of rawhide and a broken strap that had ambitions of being whole. 70's the measure between the places that claim you and the places that don't, he said. Past that, stories don't travel unaccompanied. Men who... Crane answered. Her words were measured and hard, stacked like bricks you cannot move without gaining bruises. She spoke of order and the way a levied road fed the quarter's own trade, how one woman's no could turn a whole wagon line's worth of yes into spoiled bread. She painted Pike's orders as a dull blade misused rather than a bright knife used wrong. She pressed the seal against the afternoon with each sentence until the day had marks on it, from where she'd tried to make it. Behave, Rook was asked one. Question, did you take a woman out of the governor's yard against his mark? He answered in a voice that didn't take a step it didn't mean to take. I took a woman out of a yard on smoke drawn by a midwife for a levy that used the wrong nouns. The bell swayed once on a breeze no one else felt. Reader Galen listened the way someone listens for a baby's first breath and its second. She wrote small children of their words in her book. She asked Mathers for a sentence and got a whole paragraph of duty, trying to unlearn shame. She didn't shame him. She made the words find their own feet. Shaw stood with his hat in his hands and watched the horizon for other kinds of trouble. Loke watched Pike with the kind of attention you give snakes in late spring when they're just warm enough to mean it again. Rennet fell in love with the bell and the way it had decided never to ring for anything silly. In the end, Galen closed. The book, the noise it made was not final, it was faithful. By Smoke and by Midwife, I read The Brand Invalid under quarter. Pike spluttered a sentence he had hoped not to use so soon. Crane didn't splutter. She became still the way water goes iron under frost. And under Clause 9, she asked, Galen breath. Crane's riders, not hers by uniform. Hers by instruction. They did not come straight. They fanned like the beginning of a net being thrown. Under, Rook said softly. To the culvert. Sorrel blinked. What culvert? The one men cut when they learned from a flood that didn't belong to them, he said. Quarter uses the same book, different pen. He pushed through willow and reed. There it was, a stone throat half buried under years of forgetting. Lead his head, he told her, and the gelding, who had developed a fondness for his own continued existence, lowered without needing to be reminded what that meant. Shaw spared a glance from the rim. You'll have 40 yards of blind. Blind is better than shot, Rook said, or argued with. Sorrel ducked into the culvert, shoulder scraping stone. Water slicked the floor because water never learns to get out of its own way. The dark was honest and quick. Her breath sounded larger than it had a right to. Behind her, the horse breathed with her and made a harmony she could walk to. Rook's hand found her heel and took the place of trust when trust's candle burned low. Light. Ahead, a second wash. A smell of sage that hadn't been drowned lately. She emerged into night with stars tossed carelessly across it, and the taste of iron finally gone from her teeth. Rook came behind her with the gelding's halter and 3 new scratches along his arm, like a cat had had opinions. Shaw slid last. Face a black silhouette on sky, they moved. The riders on the ridge reassembled for a try at a line they could put their fear across. Loke and Rennet disappeared and reappeared as if light had forgotten to own them. Red Post's bell did not ring. Somewhere, a coyote made a point that seemed relevant. Nearly there, Shaw said, and for a moment, Sorrel believed that there was a there, and that people like them got to hold it. The shot that followed didn't sound like Pike's careless thump or Crane's men's tidy taps. It sounded like iron sun by distance. It came late to their ears and faster to their world. It took a bite from the dirt at Rook's boot and moved a neat ounce of the world 2 feet to the left with insultingly small effort. Whitworth, Shaw hissed between his teeth, naming a rifle that made gods of men who could afford them. Bastards hired Glass. Glass? Sorrel whispered. Scope, Rook said. Eye that drinks far. He looked toward the knoll that rose along the road like a thought that had gotten ahead of itself. Half a mile, maybe more. Another shot. This one shaved the bark off a willow Sorrel had favored with trust. It did not ask her permission first. It did not care. Down, Shaw said pointlessly. They were already down. Run crooked. They did. The next shot found a place where Sorrel's life had been a moment earlier and put a neat hole in it as if to mock the idea that emptiness needed help. Red Post's line. Loke whispered, appearing at Sorrel's elbow like a reminder. 10. More breaths and a bend. Sorrel burned those breaths like bad money. The bend came, so did the next shot. It hit Rook. He didn't fall like men in stories fall, arms outstretched theatrically. He took the bullet into his side, just under the ribs, and made a sound like a decision. He stayed on his feet long enough to pass the gelding's rein into Sorrel's fist and give it a soft twist that meant, trust me, not to make this into more grief than we already have. Then he knelt because kneeling was the right geometry for the moment and not because he had run out of choices. The world narrowed to a small circle. Sorrel threw out of her like a lasso. Rook's face in it, the gelding shoulder in it, the dirt in it, the bend in it, the sound of the Whitworth eating. Distance in it. Shaw's voice hit her from outside the circle like rain on canvas. Loke's hand on her back was the pole that kept the tent from becoming a flag. Move, Rook said, not to himself and not to the horse. To her, the word sounded ripped from him with a price paid cash. Don't earn Crane's riders, not hers by uniform. Hers by instruction. They did not come straight. They fanned like the beginning of a net being thrown. Under, Rook said softly. To the culvert. Sorrel blinked. What culvert? The one men cut when they learned from a flood that didn't belong to them, he said. Quarter uses the same book, different pen. He pushed through willow and reed. There it was, a stone throat half buried under years of forgetting. Lead his head, he told her, and the gelding, who had developed a fondness for his own. Continued existence, lowered without needing to be reminded what that meant. Shaw spared a glance from the rim. You'll have 40 yards of blind. Blind is better than shot, Rook said, or argued with. Sorrel ducked into the culvert, shoulder scraping stone. Water slicked the floor because water never learns to get out of its own way. The dark was honest and quick. Her breath sounded larger than it had a right to. Behind her, the horse breathed with her and made a harmony she could walk to. Rook's hand found her heel and took the place of trust when trust's candle burned low. Light. Ahead, a second wash. A smell of sage that hadn't been drowned lately. She emerged into night with stars tossed carelessly across it, and the taste of iron finally gone from her teeth. Rook came behind her with the gelding's halter and 3 new scratches along his arm, like a cat had had opinions. Shaw slid last. Face a black silhouette on sky, they moved. The riders on the ridge reassembled for a try at a line they could put their fear across. Loke and Rennet disappeared and reappeared as if light had forgotten to own them. Red Post's bell did not ring. Somewhere, a coyote made a point that seemed relevant. Nearly there, Shaw said, and for a moment, Sorrel believed that there was a there, and that people like them got to hold it. The shot that followed didn't sound like Pike's careless thump or Crane's men's tidy taps. It sounded like iron sun by distance. It came late to their ears and faster to their world. It took a bite from the dirt at Rook's boot and moved a neat ounce of the world 2 feet to the left with insultingly small effort. Whitworth, Shaw hissed between his teeth, naming a rifle that made gods of men who could afford them. Bastards hired glass. Glass? Sorrel whispered. Scope, Rook said. Eye that drinks far. He looked toward the knoll that rose along the road like a thought that had gotten ahead of itself. Half a mile, maybe more. Another. Shot. This one shaved the bark off a willow Sorrel had favored with trust. It did not ask her permission first. It did not care. Down. Sorrel turned toward the source of the voice. A man in a coat with council red piping stepped into sight with a document that looked like it had forgotten the weight of what paper was supposed to carry. He had the face of someone who had never had to move a bale of hay and therefore believed all bales were lighter than they were. Beside him stood 2 guards who had learned to follow orders before their bodies had learned not to sweat in fear. By council writ, the man repeated, louder now that he had an audience and a law to hide in. You will not move the brand or the runner an inch until the envoy's business is concluded. Red Post is suspended under petition. Gate is held. Reader Galen's pen went still in her hand, but she did not put it down. She looked like a woman who had been asked to unlearn her own handwriting on command. Who signed that? She asked. Too quiet for men who like to hear themselves to understand the danger. Councillor Merritt, the man said. Under emergency prerogative. Shaw did not wait for permission the way the council man wanted him to. He shouldered to Sorrel. To Rook, to the horse, to the people who were a story he had decided to be part of, and said very softly, "Run on my count." The councilman saw the way Shaw's hat tilted and finally understood that paper weighed less than rifles again. He lifted his hand to his guards to change the kind of quiet he was standing in. 3. Shaw said, "On the far bank, the Whitworths." Glass winked in a way glass does when it has found a new sun to use as a sight. 2. Shaw said, and Loke lowered her center of gravity like someone had loaned her an extra inch of height and she meant to spend it well. "Sergeant, Reader." Galen said in a tone that could mean everything or nothing depending on what a man had decided to live with. "If you run now, we finish what we started," Shaw said. He took a breath. 1, he said, and the World Envoy, Council Bell. Gunn decided if it was going to move with him or try to stop the kind of motion that does not care about rules because rules stopped caring first. Sorrel grabbed Rook under the arm and felt blood make a promise to her hands, and Rook pushed up on legs that did not agree yet consented. And the gelding leapt because a good horse will go toward trouble if you point him right, just as a new horn blew from the north road, thin and urgent. And a second detachment in blue-gray came into view with a flag Sorrel had never seen before and a man at its head, whose face made the world around her feel 12 again and cold. He reined in, raised a hand that had told men to do worse, and called across the distance in a voice that owned too many rooms, "Stand," by order of Governor May himself. The girl is not merely branded, she is named witness under treason. The word did not fall into the night and lie there. It climbed the posts like fire. Rook's weight sagged in Sorrel's hands. Shaw's breath stopped just behind his teeth. Reader Galen's pen snapped not because it was cheap, but because it had just been asked to write something it refused to spell. "Witness," Crane repeated, eyes narrow, calculating a new equation in the air. The council man smiled because he thought a bigger paper had just offered to adopt him, and Sorrel, whose body had learned to move when men made words into walls, felt the muscle in her jaw go hard in a way no brand and no bullet had managed to make it yet. She lifted her head, looked at Havilah Crane, looked at the man with the governor's voice on him, looked at Shaw, at Rook, at the bell that wanted to ring and couldn't, and found her mouth forming a sentence she knew would break, something she could not fix later, and spoke, "Then hear me now. Then hear me now." Sorrel didn't raise her chin to make the sentence taller. She let it stand on its own legs. Wind pushed at the posts. The bell above them trembled as if the metal had a memory of why it was hung. Rook's blood made a small determined map in the dust beside her boot. Reader Galen's hand paused over the book, waiting the way a midwife waits for breath. "I speak under bell," Sorrel said, voice steady enough to bear the weight she was piling on it. Midwife smoke was drawn because a levy asked for what it had no right to take. "I'm a witness to that. If the governor says the word treason, then I answer as witness, not prisoner. Witness stands under court or protection. That's your floor." The councilman opened his mouth, ready to argue the shape of floors, but Galen beat him to it. "Under bell," she repeated, and her voice made the bell seem heavier. "All weapons low until the witnesses read. Envoy Crane, you will hold your men outside the ditch. Sergeant Shaw, you will hold your men inside." Crane did not look to Pike for permission. She tilted 2 fingers, precise and small as punctuation, and the blue-gray behind her shifted from threat to posture. "We will hold," she said, "for the reading." She angled one eye toward the North Road detachment and the man at its head who had spoken like a law with boots on. "Major Voss, stand your line." The major turned his horse 1 degree, which in men like him meant he had wrestled briefly with the idea of obedience and decided it did not cost him pride today. He lifted a fist and the Whitworth's glass winked, then went still. The rifleman's silhouette resolved on the far hill, a black stitch in the horizon. Shaw's shoulders loosened in increments that were visible. If you knew how to look for men returning to their own bones after borrowing iron. Under bell, he echoed. Look low, rennet eyes back. He moved without moving the way old soldiers do when the room needs to learn how to breathe again. Galen waited long enough to teach the silence a lesson. Then she set her pen and nodded at Sorrel. Speak. The act, then the hour, then the men. Sorrel did not look at Pike. That would grant him a kind of weather. She looked at the bell rope, at the frayed place near the knot, where Hans had taught it about rescue. 2 weeks before wheat planting, she said, Whetstone. Captain Pike posted a levy for road work that took boys and brooms the same day. When the town said the brooms needed to stay to keep children living, Pike said children cost the same to bury as to feed. Pike made the sound men make when their own words refused to behave in public. Crane's mouth flattened. She didn't hide that she remembered an equivalent sentence from another winter. The councilman tried to bring his paper's weight to bear, but Galen's pen clicked once against the book, and he thought better of trying to be heavier than ink. Midwife Morel Pan signaled smoke. Sorrel continued. 2 pulls then. 3, we learned that in the flood year. It means men with seals are taking the wrong thing. She sent it from the church roof, because the school roof leaks. I saw her do it. I counted the pulls and the 3, because I thought counting made it mean less. I was wrong. Counting makes it mean more. She found Rook in the corner of her vision. A steady presence, not a collapse. He sat with his back to the post base, left hand pressed hard at the wound. His eyes were on the page Galen was making. From the day. It steadied her more than any bandage could have. I refused the levy when they took a boy who was already promised to the ground, she said. Harlan Jute's youngest. You can argue whether a boy has fingers enough to hold a shovel, but you can't argue with a grave already dug. He died at winter's edge, and they put him on Morgan's Hill because spring hadn't untied the dirt yet. We don't break our dead for road work. I said that. Pike called it treason. Captain? Galen asked without looking away from the page. Pike's jaw did a small mean dance. He lifted his chin toward the governor's men as if they were mirrors he'd brought to admire himself. She refused a lawful levy, he said. She incited others to refuse. I told my mother not to put her broom down, Sorrel said. She's been dead 9 years, Captain. I incited air. A small, unbeautiful cough of laughter came from Loke and cut off when her eyes met Galen's. The reader's pen kept moving. She did not smile. She didn't have to. The line it put under the moment was its own mercy. Witness to treason? Crane asked in that cool, measured tone that made men answer whether or not they meant to. Major Vos claimed you under that word. Whose treason does the governor imagine you will speak? Voss' profile cut clean against the sky, a nose that had signed more orders than it had broken. He didn't answer her directly. He addressed the gate. By the governor's declaration, treason is at issue in the free quarters' failure to return state property and their incitement of insurrection at the levee sites. Keating witnessed the order to refuse and the violence at Tollstone Workyard. Shaw swore softly, which is to say his mouth moved and no sound agreed to be born from it. Galen's pen did not pause, but the flesh at her jaw tightened until it looked like hard wood. Crane looked at Vos without turning her head, and Sorrel thought, there, the first crack. Envoys do not appreciate men who pretend law is the same as the facts they feed it. Tell the violence, Galen said. Sorrel told it language without decoration. Enk's trembling hands that weren't trembling when they had to hold a shovel by both ends to stop a foreman using it as a club. Lute's chain whipping the wheel until his skin learned to stop bleeding, because it would need the blood later. Pike's jaw when he looked at the brand and found that it did not feel like enough. The smell of heat and old iron and someone making a fire to boil cloth and priests for once not standing on the right floor. Galen wrote it all as if the letters would have to be counted one day like coins. When Sorrel reached the place where the Ridge Riders shadowed the wagon and the night made room for a man who didn't like to spend words, she felt her mouth want to falter around Rook's name. She made it steady. "Rook Allerton." He answered. "Morell's smoke. He took me out under quarter signal." He did it without drawing blood, unless men pressed a gun barrel right up against it, and asked. Vos' voice cut across the space. He put lead through a long gun. After the long gun shot at a man, Sorrel said, "You can count those in the order they were fired, or you can count them in the order they were earned." Galen's pen made a dot, a deliberate one. "Dot says we will come back to this. Dot says we will not let the Whitworth's glass be the only eye that finishes the day seeing clearly." Rook breathed out and in and out. Sorrel could hear it now that the rest had quieted. She folded his breath into the sentence she was building, and balanced it there. The council man Merritt's clerk, she decided. Oversized for his coat and underused for his age, cleared his throat, as if it might help the world brush itself off. "Reader," he said. "By writ. By writ." Galen agreed, not looking at him. "Which does not supersede Bell. You can keep saying it until your lips chap. My book will not move for you if the bell tells it not to." Crane's gaze flicked up at the bell, as if calculating how much it would cost, in both money and human, to be accused of breaking it. Her hand on her reins went white where the leather dug in. She did not move. Shaw made a choice that showed in the way his feet adjusted themselves in the dirt. He stepped back one pace and made his profile smaller. In the Major's long glass, he had been shot at enough to inherit caution from other men's bullets. "Witnesses established," Galen said. "Envoy Crane, you can argue Clause 9 at third hour tomorrow, under Bell with 2 readers present and a clerk. For now, Quarter holds both witness and runner under protection." She set the pen on the book as a promise she could pick back. Up, Shaw moved them to ground. "Understood," Shaw said. He swung towards Sorrel and Rook, and in the swing, you could hear that he had once been a man who told other men to go into gunfire and then had to write to the mothers after. "All right, down." Now the bell had not rung. The gate had not shut, but a space opened inside the posts like a held breath that could be walked into. Loke took the gelding's rein and taught him what it meant to be quiet when your feet wanted to be elsewhere. Rennet made a path of his body where there wasn't one. Shaw put his shoulder to air and moved it like a piece of furniture. Sorrel slid an arm under. Rookson felt heat come through her sleeve that had nothing to do with the day's sun. He made a small, unwelcome sound, not much more than the breath letter H, and his mouth went thin around it. "You've done your part," she whispered into the braid of his scarf. "Let me do mine." "Your part's telling," he said, voice a grit scrape that did not ask for pity. "So tell them properly. Don't stain it with my name for sympathy." She wanted to swear at him, at his exacting fairness, at the way he took even his own pain to task for trying to be selfish. She used the want to put more of his weight on her legs and less on his. He let her have that victory without tallying it in any book. They crossed from the outer lip of the red post's shade into the house. Inside, air had decided to cool itself like reason. A cot waited as if some day had predicted this day, and a basin full of clean did the same. A woman with hair like dark water stood from the corner stool and rolled her sleeves in a way that said the job might be ugly, but the hands could be beautiful about it. "Why are you here?" Sorrel asked quietly. "At Red Post instead of Whetstone." Morell set her mouth into a firm line reserved for people who had never moved further than the river's bend. "Because babies come where they want. Because midwives go where they're asked. Because a woman out here sent me a letter that said her last 2 births ended in the ground, and she wasn't sure she could bear another without someone to say that wasn't just the way the world is. Because I learned the Quarter's rulebook so I could fight the governors with more than spit. Because ... She looked up for the first time, and Sorrel saw a fatigue there that looked like a kind of faith. Because Rook came back and I wasn't going to miss seeing the day he kept the promise he owed to the dead. Sorrel didn't say who. She figured she already knew, had heard it in the way Rook had not said a name. She kept the lamp steady. She kept breathing without making it into a performance. It felt like a stubborn prayer. Morale worked. Rook's breath staggered once, then settled. Outside, the bell's shadow moved on the floorboards like a hand on a forehead being careful. When Morel had the wound persuaded to hold itself together, she covered it with clean and bound it with the kind of care that assumes a body is going. To want to bend again, he'll keep, she said. If men don't decide to make him a thing to argue about. She looked pointedly toward the door. They will, Sorrel said. They always do, Morel said. So make them argue you instead. She stood, stretching the kinks from her back. Crane wants the sentence she can carry to her desk. Vis wants to carry you on a horse and call it law. The clerk wants not to be in trouble. Shaw wants the minimum number of funerals. Galen wants her book to be true. Give them all the sentence that fits in their hands and keeps their teeth off your throat. The door swung. Shaw ducked his head in, hat brim rucked up where some beam had taught it manners. We hold, he announced, not trusting it yet enough to make it an absolute. Vos says he has a courier coming with a signature bigger than his. Crane says she has one of her own. Galen says she's not a post office. He looked at Rook's bandage and nodded as if someone had delivered a piece of furniture on time and without dinging the corners. You whole? Rook opened one eye. Define it. Shaw's mouth made a grim shape that might have been humor with armor on. Upright enough to take a horse if I need to make you do a stupid thing. Not elegant then, Rook said. But moving. He pressed a hand near the bandage, not on it. He turned his head toward Sorrel, and for the first time since she had met him on the ridge in the dark, his face showed the barest edge of undecided. You give them the sentence? I gave it everything that would hold, Sorrel said. Good, Rook said. You'll have to give more. There's always more. Shaw leaned his shoulder to the jamb as if it had been built to hold him. The council clerk found a bigger paper with a red stripe through it. Claims petition suspends the bell's protection by emergency. Galen says the bell only stops for fire and children being born. And since one of those is under your roof already, that's that. Crane's got her jaw set like a lathe. Vos is a man who'd rather ask a bullet than a paragraph. So we're in a narrow place between two kinds of proper. Sorrel stood. The room around her didn't tilt, which she took as a good sign. I want to speak to Crane, Shaw considered. He stared at the ceiling as if to consult the timbers. If you say the wrong sentence to her, he said finally, she'd draft a new law on the spot and call it precedent. Then I'll say the right one, Sorrel said. She had not planned to believe this much in her own mouth today. It surprised her almost as much as it seemed to please Morel, who nodded once like a teacher who had waited a long time to hear a student call a map a lie. Shaw took her to the doorway. Crane stood with her banner lowered, not to surrender but to get it out of the way of her thinking. Major Vos sat his horse like a commandment. The Whitworth's glass on the far hill had the patience of a cat near the pantry. Pike had arranged his uniform so it made him look taller. The council clerk's paper had folded itself more neatly, as if increased tidiness gave it greater moral mass. Envoy, Sorrel said. You saw me as a count once, a mouth and 2 blankets. You like tidy. So do I here as a tidy. If you call me a witness, I stand under your law as yours to protect as much as mine to provide. Which one will you keep? Crane regarded her as if she were a bill that had arrived without a return address. You'll give your witness to Red Post tomorrow under bell, she said. I'll argue Clause 9 under the same bell. If law stands, I take you. If quarter reads you free, I ask counsel for appeal. Under bell is fine, Sorrel said. But hear this too, the levy's not just wrong, it's crooked. I saw Pike take coin from Bray Tallow, the road contractor, to write more names than the ledger carried. Bray paid with a ring he didn't mean to part with. Green stone, cracked on the left corner. Pike put it in his boot. If you look right now, you'll still see the leather bout where a man's vanity sits. Pike flinched. The movement was small, but it had the exact shape of a boot, trying not to remember its new secret. Crane didn't glance down. She didn't need to. She let the weight of the accusation hang in the air where men could see what it did to the curtains. "Major," she said, not taking her eyes from Sorrel. "Note it." Voss gave a tiny nod that meant a man with a field. Book would be writing it later with a pencil that respected gossip only as far as it became sworn testimony. "You say you're witness under treason," Sorrel continued. "All right. Here's treason. A levy officer taking a bribe to turn a road into a conscription, then calling anyone who says no a traitor to make his guilt look like a flag. Your law should love that sentence, Envoy, because it lets you arrest someone and call yourself a hero." Crane's lips thinned, less with offense than with the discipline of a woman, not to like having her own motivations explained to her by a girl with dust on her boots. "Be careful, Keating," she said quietly. "Truth told with theater is still theater." "Truth told quietly is still truth," Sorrel returned. "I can be quiet. I have practice." She lifted her hand so the bell's shadow cut over it. "I'll stand here tomorrow. I'll speak slow. I'll let you hear all the names. I'll tell you the number of coin lines in Bray Tallow's ledger and where his wife hides the blank seal. And if your law is worth the paper, you sharpen your pencils over. It will protect the witness first. Then you can squabble with Red Post about who gets to keep me after." Galen's pen scratched something that wasn't a word, but might have been a promise. Shaw's chin tipped a fraction, the way men nod when someone else says the thing they would have said if the day had had more room. Loke let out the kind of breath you keep until you're alone, then let it go anyway, because alone is too expensive sometimes. Rennet grinned like a boy who had just learned that bells are more than pretty iron. Pike tried again to make his jaw do the dance that had once gotten him things. It did not perform. "Envoy," he began, and Crane cut across him with a slice of her hand that would have taken off a lesser man's fingers. "Captain, you'll stand your men down from any attempt to retrieve the prisoner by force." "Witness," Galen said evenly, without venom, "not prisoner." "Not under my bell." Crane's gaze slid to her. It did not challenge. It took the correction and filed it where it would be useful later. "Witness," she amended. "If you or anyone under your authority attempt to touch Keating before the reading, I'll have you in irons under provincial statute for interfering with a recognized proceeding." Pike's face did a workmanlike impression of a man saving his dignity from drowning. "Envoy, with respect. Respect can be kept for later," Crane said. "For now, keep your distance." Voss turned his horse half a step more and called to the far hill without turning his head. "Glass down. Any man who fires without my order writes his own dismissal." The Whitworth's glint vanished. The day breathed. It was not peace. It was an armistice signed in pencil. Shaw touched Sorrel's elbow as the Red Post's shadow grew long enough to shake hands with the line of junipers to the west. "Inside," he said. "Sleep if you can. I'll sit the door. You're not allowed to worry about." Sorrel stood a moment longer under sky, letting the light redraw her without erasing the lines she liked. She looked at Crane, not at the uniform, but at the woman inside it, the one who had counted her blankets and chosen the size of mercy she could afford at the time. "Envoy?" she said. Crane's eyes tracked back and set on her face with the unsettling precision of a ledger line. "Keating." "If your courier brings a bigger paper," Sorrel said softly, "remember to ask it if it knows how much a boy costs to bury. Paper's bad at that math." Crane didn't look chastened. She looked tired. It changed her mouth by a molecule. "I have seen the numbers," she said. "They are always wrong. Go inside, Keating. Before I remember, I don't like being corrected. Sorrel went inside. The house had become a little ship with the noise of men's orders as at sea. Morel had left the cot to boil more cloth and tell Rennet that his hands needed to learn the difference between clean and useful. Rook dozed, the kind of doze a man falls into when his body is half convinced it will be consulted later. Shaw sat on a stool just outside the door, rifle across his knees, hat brim low enough to make him look like a bad mood someone had put on a hook. Night came carefully, like a cat that knows the furniture and doesn't want to be blamed for what breaks. The bell stood dark against it, a promise cast metal had learned to keep even when men forgot. Sorrel ate what someone put into her hand. She swallowed without paying attention to what it was, which was how most food gets eaten at Gatesware. Law and Horse Sweat share the same bench. Morel cleaned her brand again, hands gentle, language mean. "This letter will scab," she said. "Then it will itch so you'll consider clawing it off your bones. When you want to do that, come find me. I'll give you something bitter and something sweet and tell you about 20 women who had worse and grew old enough to be angry at all the right things. I know what they burned into me," Sorrel said. "But I don't know what I burn into myself." "Careful," Morel said. "Words make good brands if you're not particular." She touched Sorrel's cheek. "Choose verbs." Sorrel sat by Rook's cot. His breath was steady enough to balance a room on. She folded her hands so they wouldn't try to do anything foolish like rearrange the man's pain for him. The door creaked, and a shadow other than Shaw's fell across the threshold. "Reader Galen," Sorrel murmured, making space with her. Voice. Galen came in with the book under her arm and the pen tucked into its string, as if it were a tired bird. She did not offer comfort. She offered a kind of solidarity that went to its work without drum or banner. "Tomorrow," she said, "third hour, I will call 2 more readers. Council is sending one of theirs, a man who believes words can be measured with a straight edge and sign with a yardstick." She stopped at the foot of the bed. "Crane will bring witnesses. Voss will bring a way to not be present while still being armed. Pike will bring the face he wears when he would like to break furniture." Her mouth twitched. "Try to sleep anyway." "I will," Sorrel lied. Galen didn't bother to pretend not to hear it. She set the book on the stool beside the cot and went out again as if the night had asked her for her company, and she was inclined to grant it. Sleep came at Sorrel from one side, dreams from the other. She did not let the dreams choose her. She sat in the middle and put her back against the cot and told her body it could have 5 breaths now and 5 later. She drifted between them. In that drift, she felt a hand touch her shoulder and knew, without looking, whose. Rook spoke a word so soft it might have been the thought of a word. "Stay." "I will," she said this time, and meant it. Dawn rinned the world with a knife the color of butter fat. Red Post woke early, because people who keep gates learn to rise before trouble puts its boots on. Shaw looked like he had slept with his hat on and been satisfied with the arrangement. Loke had the expression of a woman who had told a coyote to go somewhere else and been obeyed. Rennet's hair had made different decisions than the rest of him. Bells don't ring for trifles, but they do get polished for trials. Rennet stood on a stool with a rag and a pot of oil, rubbing the iron with the care of a boy who had found something more resistant than his own hope and decided not to be bothered by that. Galen's table had been moved into the post's shade. 2 chairs stood to her right. "Witness," Galen said evenly, without venom. "Not prisoner." "Not under my bell." Crane's gaze slid to her. It did not challenge. It took the correction and filed it where it would be useful later. "Witness," she amended. "If you or anyone under your authority attempt to touch Keating before the reading, I'll have you in irons under provincial statute for interfering with a recognized proceeding." Pike's face did a workmanlike impression of a man saving his dignity from drowning. "Envoy with respect. Respect can be kept for later," Crane said. "For now, keep your distance." Voss turned his horse half a step more and called to the far hill without turning his head. Glass down. Any man who fires without my order writes his own dismissal. The Whitworth's glint vanished. The day breathed. It was not peace. It was an armistice signed in pencil. Shaw touched Sorrel's elbow as the red post's shadow grew long enough to shake hands with the line of junipers to the west. "Inside," he said. "Sleep if you can. I'll sit the door. You're not allowed to worry about." Sorrel stood a moment longer under sky, letting the light redraw her without erasing the lines she liked. She looked at Crane, not at the uniform, but at the woman inside it, the one who had counted her blankets and chosen the size of mercy she could afford at the time. "Envoy?" she said. Crane's eyes tracked back and set on her face with the unsettling precision of a ledger line. "Keating." "If your courier brings a bigger paper," Sorrel said softly, "remember to ask it if it knows how much a boy costs to bury. Paper's bad at that math." Crane didn't look chastened. She looked tired. It changed her mouth by a molecule. "I have seen the numbers," she said. "They are always wrong. Go inside, Keating, before I remember I don't like being corrected." Sorrel went inside. The house had become a little ship with the noise of men's orders as at sea. Morrell had left the cot to boil more cloth and tell Rennet that his hands needed to learn the difference between clean and useful. Rook dozed, the kind of doze a man falls into when his body is half convinced it will be consulted later. Shaw sat on a stool just outside the door, rifle across his knees, hat brim low enough to make him look like a bad mood someone had put on a hook. Night came carefully, like a cat that knows the furniture and doesn't want to be blamed for what breaks. The bell stood dark against it, a promise cast metal had learned to keep even when men forgot. Sorrel ate what someone put into her hand. She swallowed without paying attention to what it was, which was how most food gets eaten at gates where law and horse sweat share the same bench. Morrell cleaned her brand again, hands gentle, language mean. "This letter will scab," she said. "Then it will itch so you'll consider clawing it off your bones. When you want to do that, come find me. I'll give you something bitter and something sweet and tell you about 20 women who had worse and grew old enough to be angry at all the right things. I know what they burned into me," Sorrel said. "But I don't know what I burn into myself." "Careful," Morrell said. "Words make good brands if you're not particular." She touched Sorrel's cheek. "Choose verbs." Sorrel sat by Rook's cot. His breath was steady enough to balance a room on. She folded her hands so they wouldn't try to do anything foolish like rearrange the man's pain for him. The door creaked, and a shadow other than Shaw's fell across the threshold. "Reader Galen," Sorrel murmured, making space with her voice. Galen came in with the book under her arm and the pen tucked into its string, as if it were a tired bird. She did not offer comfort. She offered a kind of solidarity that went to its work without drum or banner. "Tomorrow," she said, "third hour, I will call 2 more readers. Council is sending one of theirs, a man who believes words can be measured with a straight edge and sign with a yardstick." She stopped at the foot of the bed. "Crane will bring witnesses. Voss will bring a way to not be present while still being armed. Pike will bring the face he wears when he would like to break furniture." Her mouth twitched. "Try to Who fired?" Crane demanded, the largeness of her fury exceeding the space her body took by a factor of 10. "Major." Voss pivoted, eyes throwing the ridge into sector lines. "Ridge 2, west." "Not ours." He snapped a hand signal no. Quartermen had been made to learn, but every one of them understood anyway. Find and flank. Sorrel hit the doorframe with her shoulder, and pain turned the edges of her vision into white cloth. She did not faint. She let the pain be her proof that she was still here. Behind her, something heavy hit Stone Shaw's shoulder. A post? Rook said her name once low, and Morrell told him to keep his mouth to his breath, because she wasn't done saving it yet. The bell rang again and again. Rennet kept pulling, hands red, face set. Hold! Galen shouted through the noise, to both quarters of the world at once. Envoy, under bell. Crane raised her banner not as symbol, as signal. Her riders, who had been trained to read her cloth-like scripture, repositioned without creating any new words for trouble. The council clerk flattened himself against an idea of safety and found out it was wallpaper. Outside, men moved. Somewhere west, a horse screamed in that sickening way animals have made when the world had mistaken them for soldiers. The Whitworth did not fire a fourth time. Whoever had touched it either decided the bell was too expensive to break further under quarter eyes, or had been persuaded that continuing to be alive would be easier if he left. Inside, Shaw said. Again when the bell's echo loosened its grip on the air. He didn't ask. He put his hand on Sorrel's back and the other on the door, and both hand and door obeyed Dot. They got Rook to the back room and onto the cot. Morrell shoved Shirts under his side to prop him, then yanked them out and did it another way that made the color return to his mouth. You'll live despite men, she told him. Which is the best sort of living? Bell? He asked. Bit, Sorrel said, and her voice almost broke on the word. They bit it. Rook closed his eyes, and the lines at the corners of them told a story it took a long time to tell properly. They'll try to say it means it doesn't bind now. Galen won't let them, Sorrel said. Galen will try to make right with paper in a room where men will argue with lead. Morrell muttered, sewing anger into her thread to make it hold. Shaw will make them hear the first argument. You make them hear the second. What's the second? Sorrel asked. Your name, Morrell said. You tell them your name, and you make them say it back to you until it sticks. Witness isn't just a noun, it's a person. Shaw's shadow blocked the door. He took off his hat and ran a hand over his hair like a man giving himself a quick benediction. We've got a new problem, he announced in a tone that meant the old problems. We're merely more honest. Which flavor? Morrell asked without looking up. The council reader grew a spine. Shaw said. Merritt's man. He's declared Red Post unfit to hold Bell until structural inspection. He made the quotation marks with his voice more than his fingers, because of the bite out of it. He says all proceedings suspend and the witness transfers. Custody. Sorrel felt it before she thought it. The familiar cold of men's words trying to undo a day. To whom? Shaw's eyes cut to her, then away, because he didn't like being the messenger for a sentence he intended to fight. To the nearest secure authority, which to him means Crane, Morrell said, or Vuss, Shaw said. He's arguing both sides of his mouth in case one gets chapped. Galen? Sorrel asked. Furious, Shaw said, and the word sounded almost affectionate in his mouth. But she will not break law to save law. That would make her the sort of reader who forgets why she got the book in the first place. Sorrel stood. The room wobbled. She told it to stop. It obeyed. She walked past Shaw and out into daylight that had gotten itself blood-warm and stubborn. Galen stood with her hands on the table, knuckles showing white. Crane stood opposite, banner lowered, face set in a configuration Sorrel now recognized as her thinking helmet. Vos held his men. Pike held his tongue like a man who wants to chew glass, but knows better. The council clerk held the writ with a tremor that betrayed either fear or excitement. Sorrel did not care which. Reader, Sorrel said. You can't. Let them take me under a broken bell. Galen looked up, and in her eyes Sorrel saw a page with every line already written, and none of them the right one. I can't make the bell unbit by declaring it, she said. If I try, my pen stops telling the truth, and then everything else stops being worth penning. She scrubbed a hand over her face. I have to call for a new bell or a repair. That takes time we don't have. Crane's gaze flicked between them. I can hold her, she said unexpectedly. Under envoy mark, not governor. Temporary, until a fresh bell rings or a council engineer writes me whose hammer to trust. Major Vos, you can put your glass on me if it will make you feel better about your headlines later. She met Sorrel's eyes. If I hold you, I carry the obligation to keep you breathing. Under my name. Under my job. I don't take that cheaply. Sorrel's mouth half opened and then closed again on gratitude that was not ready to be heard. You also carry the right to hand me over, she said. Crane didn't flinch. I always carry the right, she said. I'm offering the obligation. Decide which you want me to use. Shaw made a low sound, not disagreement, exactly more than noise windows make when the wind remembers they exist. Galen studied Crane as if she were a plant that had grown in a new direction overnight. The council clerk brightened at the thought of any resolution that involved someone else making the final sentence. Vos didn't brighten. He didn't have that verb in him. He sharpened, which in him meant the day would be more precise and less bearable. Envoy Mark, Sorrel said slowly. Witness under envoy protection. That suits your tidy. Crane inclined her head, a tiny nod that cost her more than men would guess. It does. I'll go, Sorrel said. She felt Shaw's eyes on her and felt the tug of Morell's hand from behind, even though it was not physically there. She did not turn toward either, under envoy Mark. Under the condition that Rook Allerton remains in quarter hands. He's not your witness, he's your problem if you take him. And you don't like problems. Crane's mouth did something small that might have been the kind of respect two women exchange when they both decide to walk into weather, without asking it to be kinder. Accepted, she said. Vos? Envoy Mark is yours to spend, he said. The words were even. The glare in them was not. He wanted his paper to win more than he wanted the day not to hurt anyone. But I will be at your shoulder to count. How you spend it. Count, Crane said. She turned to Galen. Reader? Galen closed her eyes for a heartbeat. When she opened them, they were clear like water after a storm. Under broken bell, under envoy protection, pending fresh bell, read and recorded. She lifted the pen and wrote the sentence that would make itself into tomorrow if they all lived. Shaw's jaw ran a hard line from ear to chin and back again. I don't like it, he said. But I like the alternatives even less. He looked at Sorrel and without saying the thing that would make it theater, offered her his hand. She took it and found another kind of vow in the grip there, not to law, not to bell, but to the stubborn human practice of seeing someone and deciding to be on the same side as their breathing. They made arrangements as if that word meant safety. It never does. Crane called for a small detail, not her whole line, because men with drums make poor escorts for witnesses. Vos set two riders out to shadow, the kind of shadow that counts its footsteps. Shaw assigned Loke to the left flank and Rennet to the right, whether or not the envoy considered them hers to assign. Morell packed a bag with Willow and a scalpel and an opinion. Where? Sorrel asked. Tollhouse, Crane said. Midway. Between here and Sheer Bridge. It has a strong room and a roof, and windows? Shaw asked. Crane's eyes flickered, conceding the point without saying it. And windows. Which you, Sergeant, are welcome to stand under if you think your hat will catch bullets. I think my hat's caught worse, Shaw said. He glanced toward the house. He's not moving. He is not, Morell said. And if any of you cross the threshold with your argument, I'll make you bleed and call it medicinal. She kissed Sorrel's hair the way the old do when they are young in the exact place they want to be. Bring me one sentence worth keeping when you come back. Sorrel swallowed the flint in her throat. I will. They set out when the sun had climbed to the kind of height that makes men annoyed at their own shadows. Crane rode at the fore with the banner rolled and tied to keep it from declaring more than she currently wished to declare. Vos loped far enough to be support and close enough to be seen. Pike was not with them. He asked to accompany, and Crane said, Captain, you've done enough. And that was that. The road to Tollhouse. was the same road Sorrel had been dragged down 3 days ago in a rattling wagon. It looked different from a saddle. It looked different under quarter sky with men who were trying, however badly, to behave. Loke ranged left, reading the ground like a ledger written in hoof and claw. Rennet ranged right and tried not to fall. In love with every hawk that let him count it without flying away, they reached Toll House near the hour when Kitchen start thinking about onions. It stood on a low rise like a child who had taught himself to be tall brick, a little too proud of its corners, with a cupola that held a small bell jealous of the larger one at Red Post. Crane dismounted and gave orders that made sense even to men not used to obeying women. Voss didn't argue. He outranked everyone while choosing not to act like it. Sorrel tied the gelding, and the horse breathed into her palm and told her, in horse, that he would be here when the world needed him again. Inside, the strong room turned out to be a room with 2 doors and thick walls, and a table sturdy enough to sit on if someone made you. The windows were high, which meant a man would have to stretch to put his eye where it could be useful. "We'll use this," Crane said. "I'll set my seal here and call it a chamber." "Call it what you like," Shaw said. "We'll hold it as if it were a barn and a storm." He made a quick walk of the perimeter, the kind of walk that, teaching soldiers to count corners, gives a man. Loke drifted in the opposite direction. Rennet peeked into the pantry and mouthed the holy word, pickles. Crane ignored him in the way a woman ignores boys when they are not hurting anyone. They had been in Toll House 30 minutes when the horn on the north road blew, not a regiment call, not a quarter signal, a different sound that raised the hair on the back of Shaw's neck and made Crane's head tilt like a bird who had heard a new predator for the first time. Voss stepped to the door. The riders outside turned as one. Loke vanished. Rennet dropped the jar of pickles. It didn't break. It landed on his boot and reminded him to love his toes later. Over the rise came men without colors. Not pikes, not cranes, not quarter. Their hats told one story low, curled, used to lying, and their horses told another hard-ridden, tragic, thirsty. Sorrel knew the shape before her mouth remembered its naming. She'd seen them in the distance on the ridge 2 days ago, and again in the wash where her life had turned on the fulcrum of a man's balance. "Coyotes," she said, and Shaw nodded once as if the name had earned the arithmetic. They were. Not scavengers. They were a crew Bray Tallows hired quiet, the hands he paid when he needed a job done outside the ledger. They did not bother with speeches. They fanned to cut the road in the back way and the goat track in the dry creek. At once, one of them raised a thing that was not a flag, exactly a strip of oilcloth and a ring of green stone tied to it like a joke. "Bray sends his regards," the man called, voice cheerful as a morning market. He'd prefer the witness stop. Saying the wrong words about his ring, Crane went very still. Voss did not. He lifted his hand and his men drew rifles without making the sound that registered as permission. Shaw moved to the window and Loke to the other. Rennet put the pickles down where they would be safe. Sorrel's brand burned hot, then cold and settled into a way of making itself known that would not be put off by augmentation. Inside, Crane said to Sorrel, voice like a door closing against rain. Now, Sorrel stepped into the strong room. Shaw followed and set himself at the left-hand window. Loke took the right. Crane stood in the doorway so any bullet that didn't like her would have to admit it. Voss posted 2 of his riders on the cupola and set the rest in a half circle, like a man who had learned geometry by putting it into practice. The coyotes didn't charge. They nested. One slid off his horse and set a crate as a rest for a rifle that had cost more than a decent wedding. Another took out a horn of his own and blew a note that was not music but signal. "We are patient and paid." Crane didn't bother to shout a warning. She didn't bother to ask them what they wanted. They had already told her. She lifted her chin at Voss. "We hold." Voss nodded. "We hold." Sorrel put her hands flat on the table until the wood recognized her. The room smelled like old paper and new worry. Outside, men arranged themselves to write a sentence none of them would want to say aloud afterward. A fly traveled in a straight line across the table like stubbornness personified. Sorrel remembered Morel's instruction. Choose verbs. She said without taking her eyes off the window where Loke's profile cut the light. If I die here, it's your mark on the paper. Crane didn't turn. You won't, not today. How do you know? Because I say so, Crane said. And I do not say so lightly. The first shot came from the crate. It was not a Whitworth. It had that hungry, sloppy sound cheaper. Guns have when they want to be grand. It slapped brick and broke where it found a corner. Shaw's return shot did not answer it directly. He shot the rest, the crate, a neat hole that turned the peddler's box into a man who realized he'd leaned his life on a rotten beam. The man swore and ducked. Pretty, Loke said under her breath. Economy, Shaw said. Equally low. A rider broke off and wheeled toward the goat track behind the toll house. Loke pivoted and put a round into the dirt at his horse's feet. The horse decided it liked being alive and taught the rider humility at speed. Crane raised her banner. Vos's men tightened their half circle but did not fire. The coyotes adjusted and found out how small a circle can be when the people inside it have decided to be stubborn professionally. Bray thinks this will make me shut up. Sorrel murmured. That's how Bray thinks, Loke said without taking her eye from the window. That when a woman says a word he doesn't like, he can subtract the woman and the math will behave. Will it? Sorrel asked. Loke's mouth hid a shape that might later, when they were old and safe, be called a smile. No, the rifle. With the expensive scope to the west fired once, as if to announce it had been invited to the party after all. It hit the lip of the toll house cupola and sent a chip flying that nearly cut Vosman's ear right off. Vos lifted his hand. His own long gun spoke, not to where the flash had been, but to the place a man tends to lean when he is foolish enough to think he can lean twice. The same way without consequence, the scope shattered. A distant swear lofted and dropped like a short prayer. Glass gone, Vos said, like a man closing a ledger entry. Shaw exhaled. And I just started to enjoy his company. The coyotes moved, not forward sideways. That was worse. Sideways meant thinking. One slid close to the dry creek bed and began stacking rock in a way that made Shaw's hair remember another war. They're going to try to make fire, he said. Smoke us from our snug. Crane didn't look at him. Don't let them. Wasn't planning to, Shaw said. He leaned, put 2 rounds into 2 separate piles and made them stop being ambitions and returned to being rocks. Vosman held well. Sorrel had not meant to be relieved by that. She was. The sound of coordinated discipline is a specific comfort, like a familiar prayer, even when you don't believe in the God it's addressed to. Loke breathed with her rifle. It made a small duet in the strong room. Rennet swore softly behind. The pantry door had ajar that wouldn't open, and then remembered where he was and prayed to the pickle instead. The coyotes stopped pretending they were not what they were. The man with the green stone ring on his oilcloth sash stood and called, cheerful as ever. Keating. Bray says come out and swear you were mistaken. He'll pay for a new bell. Sorrel set her palms harder on the table until they creaked like a good yoke. Bray can buy his own ears a new story, she called back. I'm busy. The man laughed, delighted. Busy being brave? Busy being stupid? Busy being heard, Sorrel said. Try it sometime. It's cheaper than bells. Shot answered her. Not crude, not precise. Just ugly. It hit the wall above Loke's head and powdered brick into her hair. She shook it out and fired once. Somewhere, a man learned how to drop at a run. Crane counted men without counting, the way women count when they're all out of fingers. They'll test us in 3s, she said to Vos, then in 5s. Then in everything they have before it gets dark and their nerve goes home. Vos nodded once. He adjusted the line half an inch. It looked like nothing. It moved the world. We hold. The blade slid between two planks the way a lie slides between two sentences. Sorrel didn't see it. She felt it, the way the air around Rook changed. His breath hitched and dropped to the ground like something precious that had been pushed out of his hands. Easy, the voice outside said, close enough to fog the crack in the door with its own heat. You take one step, girl, and I put this back where it does more than wake him. Sorrel's body made a choice before her mouth did. Her left hand rose of its own accord toward the wood, palm open, as if she could talk the door into moving. For her and not for them. I hear you, she said, steady because steadiness would have to be the rope they all used. You want me on the step. You think eyes make the killing prettier. A soft chuckle. Not prettier, neater. Shaw had frozen to the shape of the jam, no wasted motion. Only concentration, the kind you can spend like coin if you've counted it out beforehand. Loke flowed into the space under the right window where its shadow gave back. A different answer when you asked it questions about range and angle. Crane's banner stood halved by the doorframe. She hadn't lifted it higher yet because symbols like to get ahead of lives, and she was stingy with that kind of mistake. Let go of the blade, Sorrel said to the ear on the other side. And in her head she told her own feet, are you listening to me? Because you're about to think you walk the world. You heard him again, and I'll make you a new name to carry. One bell rings it. Another bell calls you to dig with it. The metal shifted in the wood. Rook breathed once too shallow and then again with intent. Don't, he said, the syllable dragging through his throat like a wagon through clay. They'll use you up because you make light. And if I don't, they'll use you up because you're quiet, Sorrel said. The words for him. And not for the plank. She swallowed, and the swallow tasted like new iron, straight from the fire. Envoy, she said, without looking away from the door, if I step out, do you hold the rule that says a witness is yours and alive? Crane's jaw flexed as if she were cutting a piece of meat she didn't trust with a dull knife. Under my mark, she said. Yes. Shaw, Sorrel said, this is going to make you curse. It's not a day yet if I don't, he said. She breathed once, like a coin she would only spend if she had to. Then she nodded at Loke, the tiniest angle a neck could make and still be called consent. Loke's finger twitched, not a signal, but a promise. I see the blade. I see the man holding it. I have something for him that is not a bullet, because sometimes you teach with other instruments. On the step, the voice insisted. Now. On my count, Shaw murmured. No. Sorrel said, on mine. She put her left hand flat against the door and felt Rook's breath through the wood like a fly's feet. She put her right hand around the old iron latch until the cold of it agreed to be hers. Listen, she said to the wood and to whatever listened through it. You're going to stop being a door. You're going to be a sentence. You'll open for me because I said so. But you won't open for anyone else. She smiled without humor. If that sounds like stubbornness, that's because it is. Shaw's mouth did a hard thing that might someday be called admiration. On you, he said. Sorrel lifted the latch. The door gave. Light cut a blade into the room across Rook's bandage and her shirt and Shaw's brim. Sorrel stepped into it like a woman who had decided to dance with storm. Loke moved when the light did. The long stick she had kept leaning in the corner, an old broom handle with a nail canted into its end, jabbed through the gap and levered the knife sideways, hard against the plank. A curse bloomed on the far side, ugly and wet. Now. Sorrel said. Shaw swung the door as if it were a shield and a gate at once. Crane slid to the edge of it with her banner full and visible. And Sorrel stepped to the threshold and made a promise to herself. Not to step back until she had written something on the day. Outside, the toll house yard held its breath. Coyotes fanned under orders that were written on money, not paper. Vos. Riders kept their half-circle like a vowel the man inside them could slip through or pronounce. Pike stood to the left of that circle with a face that looked like good chisel work and bad taste. The council clerk's eyes were too bright with victory borrowed from someone else. The sky hung steady and judgmental, as it always did. Sorrel didn't look at any of them first. She looked at Rook's shadow on the floor just inside the door. He wasn't in it. Sorrel made herself a promise she could keep. Nobody drags me from this line, I decide. Then she stepped onto the toll house step. The Coyotes' leader, the one who wore Bray Tallow's green stone on a loop of oilcloth, like a joke about honesty, grinned around a tooth he'd had mended by a man with a heavy hand. "Mornin'." "Witness," he called. Sure is bright for funerals. Sorrel let the insult go past her like a bee. You don't swat unless it lands. "Bring me Merritt," she said. "If the council wants his clerk's name to still mean clerk when this is done." "He's not here," the clerk said. And Sorrel heard the crack, the word not made where it met truth. Crane lifted her banner. "Under envoy protection," she said. And the banner turned the light into a line you couldn't cross and still tell yourself you were a good man later. "Any man who fires at the witness fires at me." She didn't look at Vos when she said it. She didn't need to. Vos' jaw bunched the way a man's jaw does when he signs a paper and knows he will have to explain it to a superior who has never been dirty. "My men hold," he said. "But hear me clear, if a bullet cuts that banner, I will cut the day in half." Pike smiled as if the blade out of the door had been part of his plan all along, as if the skirts of events lifted for him when he snapped his fingers. "Witness," he said, almost pleasant. "Testify to the governor. Throw your stories under law that can actually do something with them. Or stay. Let these farmers and women burn a bell trying to be important." Sorrel turned her head and looked at him full. "The only thing law does here is remember," she said. "You don't want that. That's why you brought a knife to a door." Pike's smile thinned. "That's why I brought a rope for a traitor," he said evenly. "We can make space for the witness next to her." He nodded to the coyote with the oilcloth sash. "Do it." The man lifted his gun, not toward Sorrel, but toward the loop of rope Pike's order implied, as if to say, "I'll shoot it down for you if this turns sentimental." Sorrel watched the small-tell women have to learn in a world of men with decisions, the way his left foot angled when he chose cruelty over laziness. She raised her voice, not loud, not desperate, just tuned to the frequency that makes men listen and not know why. "Bray Tallow," she said. 38 miles south, 3 miles east of Double Dog Spring. House with a yellow porch. Ring with a green stone, cracked on the left. Pays men in oilcloth to carry it because he thinks a joke makes a sin lighter. Kept a ledger with 2 sets of columns, work done and work bought. She scanned the line until she saw shock open in a coyote's face and then close quick, as if it were indecent to be seen like that in daylight. "Your brother works his kitchen," she said to that one, and saw the flinch. "That mean anything to you?" Loke breathed out behind her. A part of her laugh caught in a rifleman's lungs. Shaw didn't laugh. He didn't have laughter to spare, but his attention pressed itself flatter against the door jamb, ready to spend itself on anything that moved wrong. "Witness," Crane said into the moment, voice a blade hammered into tone. "Speak your statement for the record." Sorrel did. Under the toll house step, under the envoy's banner, under the glass of men who desperately needed this to become a story they could manage later, she spoke it from the beginning again so no one could claim they hadn't heard it whole. Smoke from a midwife's hands. A levee that pretended to be a road and found it liked being a conscription better. A ring with a green crack. A brand put where dresses go to work. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lower it. She let it stack. Like bricks. When she reached the part where a silent man had answered Smoke with saddle and put his own blood on the line between quarters, she felt the wood of the step under her feet steady, as if it had decided not to splinter on her account today. She didn't look back. She kept the story going because stories don't stop for pain. The coyotes shifted. The kind of shifting that said some of them had come for money, and some had come for the day, and some had come because men like Bray Tallow knew they would and paid them only with the sense of belonging that clots around bad work. Those men didn't shift at all. Crane didn't breathe for whole sentences. And when your captain called the word treason, he made a sentence that doesn't fit in my mouth, Sorrel finished. So I give it back to him. Let him choke on it. That's my witness. Silence fell the way hot bread falls on a table heavy, wanting to be torn. Only Shaw's voice moved, and it moved like gravel. Recorded, he said, as if he were ink, and this was exactly what ink did with its life. The coyote with the oilcloth. Sash rocked back on his heels and grinned wider. And now comes the part where the world doesn't care what you said, he announced, sing-song. Because Bray says words don't build roads, and he's got 3 contracts says he's right. That's the part, Sorrel said, where you learn contracts burn. He gestured at the toll house with a little flourish that would have been ridiculous if the day had room left for ridicule. You want to try? Sorrel set her jaw. Only if you insist. He lifted his gun. Crane lifted her banner higher. Vaugh's hand came up, and his men did the disciplined miracle of staying put when staying put was a face-first argument with fear. Pike turned his horse 1 step to the side to see better. And then, out of the doorway behind Sorrel, Morel Pan said conversational and fierce all at once, "Boys, it's a hot day. It's a long day. You don't want to add a fire to it unless your mothers raised you for stupidity." The coyote's grin faltered, just enough. Sorrel took the breath Crane hadn't been taking. "If we fight, we fight," she called. "I'm done being moved. But if we don't, then hear this. I'll be at Red Post at 3rd bell tomorrow with the same words and more names. If you want to be the man who stood between a witness and a bell, write that on your own tombstone now, with teeth marks." The coyote with the oilcloth ring looked at Pike for a signal, because even men who sell their souls sometimes ask for a receipt. Pike didn't give one. He had started to calculate, and it showed in the tiny movements of his eyes. Calculations are loud to anyone who listens for them. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. The wind came across the scrub as if it had been running late and brought an apology in dust. Crane let her banner drop a finger's width, which is as close to relief as women like her let their bodies do in public. Voss inclined his head a degree at Sorrel. That wasn't thanks, exactly, but was the cousin of thanks that had grown up under discipline. Shaw eased the door inward 1/2 an inch, and behind it Sorrel heard Rennet sob once in the pantry, and then pretend he hadn't. "Envoy," Voss said without the anger he usually saved for orders he disliked. "We move. Toll house is a mouth. Too easy to choke." "The ridge will be worse," Crane said, "but it's ours." She looked at Sorrel. "Back inside. We walk. I'll take your words in my pocket and your body in my line." Sorrel stepped back over the threshold with the caution of a woman who has lived between 2 enemies long enough to distrust all floors. Shaw shut the door. The blade withdrew from the crack like a story that didn't like its ending. Morel moved to rook before the delay could hurt him again. Her hands put themselves where the day had asked them to be and refused to leave. "What did you buy with that?" Rook asked Sorrel when the room caught them, his voice ragged but exact. "Time," she said. "A handful. I'll spend it badly if you don't stop bleeding." "Spend it loud," he said. They moved. Crane's line expanded, contracted, became a moving shape that let Sorrel stay at its center without turning her into an object. Voss riders slotted in where the road narrowed and pounded the dust where it widened. Loke ranged. Rennet counted his cartridges the way boys count their fears. Shaw watched Angles like a man who had learned to read the language geometry speaks when it's in a bad mood. The coyote shadowed. Bratello's money didn't pay. For men to sprint, it paid for men to lurk. Pike kept to the far left, close enough to call orders, far enough not to be touched by the consequence of them. Mathers, jaw newly bruised from having told the truth, walked with his hands open at his sides as if to remind the world he was empty. The road rose. The wind found its voice and used it to throw seed out of the grasses. Somewhere a hawk made a comment without taking sides. A mile out, the first shot came from the northeast in a voice too precise for coyotes. Vos lifted 2 fingers. "Not ours," he said. "Long glass? Council?" Crane asked, "Or cousins," Vos said, and that was all the word he seemed willing to spend on it. They reached a saddle between 2 shoulders of land where rock knew better than to pretend it was soft. Shaw threw his palm up, the line compressed. "Half circle here," he told Vos. "Envoy in the bowl, witness with her. We make them come down." Vos didn't argue because Shaw's eyes had a map in them he could read. Do it. They held. Coyotes cast and sniffed like bad dogs trying to decide whether to be brave. The long glass from the northeast blinked, as if a man behind it had blinked at the same time without meaning to. The sky lowered its weight a degree. Sorrel felt the change in the air, the way women feel rain 3 hours before clouds do. She wet her lips and tasted the decision in it. "Crane," she said. "If Merritt's hired his own glass, he'll make his move where he thinks Law squints." Crane's mouth pulled with an old, private grief. "Law has more squints than eyes," she said. "But you're not wrong." She turned to Shaw. "We need a second bell." Shaw's bark of humor barely qualified as such. "Envoy, if I could. Pull bells out of my pockets, I'd be a richer man." He looked at the little cupola on a hill to the south. "But there's a shepherd's call there sometimes. A triangle hung from a beam." "Better than nothing," Crane said. "Rennet run." Rennet went. Legs a little too long for his hurry, heart too big for his skin. He took the hill like a boy running for bread. The coyotes saw him and didn't understand what to do about a boy in a triangle. Thus understood. He put 3 riders in between Rennet and the worst of Bray's patience. The long glass blinked again, and this time a puff of dust kicked at Rennet's heel. "Close," Loke said. Flat and admiring, Rennet reached the beam, grabbed the triangle, and hit it with a stick he didn't have seconds before, because boys always find sticks. The sound was thin, but it carried. It was enough to remind the ridge and the sky and the men who were about to teach each other new ways to die that people lived here, who weren't interested in being stories on other men's tongues. The long glass shot again. The triangle rang on its own, and Rennet laughed and kept hitting it, because the body sometimes gets to make the right choice, even when the mind is busy being afraid. The ridge to the northeast answered with movement, not the long, patient creep of a sniper, but the short, angry burst of men who had been waiting for a signal they didn't admit to themselves they were waiting for. Blue-gray coats, Council red stripe. Merritt in person. He rode like a man who believed knowledge made him safe. His beard was excellent. His hat was wrong for the light. He lifted his paper like a talisman. "By Council writ," he shouted, "I arrest the envoy for subverting lawful transfer. I arrest the witness for perjury. I arrest your sense," Crane said, and the words cut across as the way wind cuts dust. "Stand down." She raised her banner, and in the same breath, Vos riders shifted to make it bigger than cloth. Merritt flinched. He was not used to women telling him where to put his body. He pointed his paper like a weapon. "Quarter has rescinded bell under damage. Council holds field." He smiled as if he had practiced in a mirror and didn't realize it showed. "Major," he called sweetly, "arrest the envoy, gently." The men in blue-gray behind him made their faces into masks that said, "We are not embarrassed to be this obvious." Vos didn't move. He didn't say no. He said, "My men hold," which is the kind of no you regret later if you are the sort of man who regrets. Merritt's smile went smaller. He flicked his fingers, the way a man flicks crumbs off a table he didn't set. Two fusiliers with polished boots came forward with the polite look of people who move furniture for a living and take pride in not scuffing the walls. Shaw didn't ask anybody. He stepped into their path and held up his hand. "Don't," he said. "Go home, kiss your mothers. Send me a letter when you get old enough to be ashamed." They hesitated, and then the world stopped hesitating for everyone. From the far west, from beyond Bray's money and Pike's anger, came the sound of hooves that were not careful. They were furious. They threw dust like a declaration. The coyotes turned and then turned again because direction had become a joke. The long glass angled toward the sound because even men who think they control days know when days decide they do not want to be controlled. They came over the lip like weather you forgot you prayed for. Riders in quarter gray, yes, but not Crane's tidy line. This was a wedge with a name red post riders, Belle Furious, Galen herself at their head like a woman who had borrowed anger for charity and was now done being polite about returning it. The bell on a wagon behind them swung with a dent in it where the Whitworth had bitten it, and still rang true enough to be heard in the marrow of men who had wanted it not to. "Underbell," Galen called, and her voice did not ask law to behave. It told it to. Merritt's smile broke. Pike's jaw did its small dance and fell. The coyote with the oilcloth ring lifted his gun and then considered whether it might be more profitable to be somewhere else. Voss' head tipped, humor so dry it might burn if you breathed on it. Galen rode right to the edge of the bowl and pointed her pen like a blade. "Witness," she said to Sorrel. "Finish." Sorrel didn't ask if she meant the sentence or the day. She opened her mouth, took breath from the bell, and spoke the last thing she had saved to spend. Merritt paid Bray tallow to pad the levee so council could run a road through Quarter Farms without paying for it. He's got a ledger under his office floor. 2 boards down, 3rd nail rusted. He keeps the key to the floor in his waistcoat and tells himself that makes it holy. Merritt's hand went involuntarily to his chest. He half laughed, a sound like a fork dropped in dirt. "Absurd," he said. "Defamation." "Open your coat," Sorrel said, not moving. "Show us your key." Men always think secrets make them heavier or lighter. They don't. They change the way you hold yourself. Merritt's shoulder hiked a degree. Voss saw it. Crane saw it. Shaw saw it. The coyotes didn't see it because they weren't paid for seeing. Galen saw it, and her pen wrote the seeing on the air. "Underbell," Galen said. "You'll show it, or I'll write you more naked than you've ever been." Merritt's face turned into the kind of thing that makes women remember all the ways men make rooms unsafe. He reached for his waistcoat button. His fingers fumbled. He tugged. The triangle on the shepherd's beam rang again. The long glass fired. Shaw. Cursed because curses are single-syllable prayers designed to be used under fire. He moved, shoved Crane, grabbed Sorrel, dragged all the same motion, all the same muscle. The bullet cut the banner's cloth just above the crossbar. Crane's staff shuddered. The banner held. "You see that?" Voss spat. "You see that, Merritt? That's your law." He snapped his hand and his riders became a door you have to be born to open. The coyotes, true to their name, decided to eat elsewhere. They melted. Pike did not. He charged because he had never learned the difference between courage and appetite. Shaw pivoted, put a bullet through Pike's hat. The hat remembered it had not been asked and fell. Pike reined up hard. His horse decided to be his veteran and refused to die for him. Galen didn't flinch. She didn't need to. The bell behind her had decided to sing until men remembered how to listen. Sorrel stood in the sound of it and realized the step under her feet was no longer a step. It was a place. It was the exact middle of a line that had tried to own her and had failed. It was hers as long as she kept making it into a sentence. "Finish," Rook had said. She lifted her chin and did. "Dervin Pike," she called, and his name looked ugly in sunlight. "You took coin for boys you didn't know. You took a ring you didn't earn. You used a brand because you didn't have a story strong enough to do the work. I am not what you wrote." She touched the cloth. Over the letter on her collarbone, like a woman making a sign over her own heart and finding it enough. "I am the one who answered smoke. I am the one carried 70 miles on silence. I am the witness. Hear me." It should have ended there. It did not. From the left, the thin scrub where goats make their private paths, a shot sang. It wasn't long glass. It wasn't Coyote cheap. It was close and mean and professional, and had chosen its hour with patience. Sorrel saw the glint of a barrel, and then the barrel disappeared. Her body moved faster than her fear. She turned, but not toward the ground. Toward the door. Toward the cot. "Rook," she said, and the name came out the way water comes out. Of a spring it has kept for a long season. She didn't know she had stepped, but she had. The bullet took the space where her lungs had been a heartbeat before. Morrell shouted something that should have been a blessing and wasn't. Shaw fired, once, twice. Vos roared. Galen's pen went vertical like a sword. Sorrel reached the door. In 2 strides that didn't feel like they belonged to her. "You don't get to choose the hour," she told her body without breath to spare. "You only get to choose the verb." She threw herself into the shadow of the frame. The second shot took the corner of the door and turned it into teeth. She felt a hand on her shoulder crane. "Shaw," and shrugged it off because the hand turned her into something other than the thing she had decided to be. "No," she said. "I'm not done." She turned back out into the light and lifted her voice to the exact height of a bell, and the world tilted under her boots as smoke belched from the toll house eaves. Fire, somewhere. Bray's men had finally found a use for their money. The roof turned into a mouth swallowing itself. "Out!" Shaw shouted. "All of you!" Morrell's cry cut through it. "The quiet man!" "Rook!" Sorrel spun for the door as flames licked upward, and the third shot split the air, the one she never heard because fire has its own language and it was speaking it now. And when she crossed the threshold, a figure rose from the hearth shadows. With a blade bright as midday, the edge kissing the brand under her collarbone before her mind knew it had a body there. And the blade stopped because Rook's hand was on the man's wrist, and Rook's face was a lesson about what quiet can do when it decides to be loud. 2 breaths. One long wordless look. The man twisted free and lunged not toward Rook, but toward Sorrel's throat. Outside, the bell rang and the banner snapped and the long glass found a new angle and the Coyotes broke and ran, and Merritt reached for his Westcott button with a shaking hand, and Vuss drew a bead, and Shaw shouted her name with a syllable that had saved men before. And Sorrel felt the blades cold against her skin and made her choice to step forward into it.